Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Big Brother Canada retrospective 10 years after that season's initial release, where here I'm going to be talking about Big Brother Canada 3, a season that I do think gets a bit of a mixed reception in the online community, one that definitely has some big highlights across the season, some of the biggest moments in really all of Big Brother Canada, and also some really iconic characters for the show, though at the same time, again, does have a ridiculous number of twists, while also this feeling like a bit of a transitionary season for Big Brother Canada, kind of introducing some of the more negative aspects of the show. So again, I think the general opinion on this season is relatively mixed, and I'm somebody that at the time I remember really loving this season. I thought this season had some really fun gameplay throughout it, a really interesting cast, and as time goes on, while I definitely do get the criticisms with the season, do agree with a lot of them, I do still find this season to be, again, kind of like a middle of the road season for me. I do think it's a season that definitely has some high points and some really iconic moments, but one that also has some big failings that we'll end up talking about. But and with that, I will be talking through my thoughts on the entirety of the season. So let's start off with week 1, the premiere episode. But I'll say right away with this premiere, you can instantly tell a bit of a bigger budget with this season. The fact that we get a proper aesthetic theme for the season, with there being this steampunk theme, we have like this massive vault, and we get talk about how there's an unexpected twist that Canada holds the key to. I do think part of that comes from the fact that this is the first ever season on Global. Even though I know the first 2 seasons of Big Brother Canada were on Slice, a cable network, while now it was on Global, one of the main channels in Canada. And through that, I think you could definitely tell this kind of higher level of production value that was utilized on this season that kind of sticks with BB Can throughout the rest of its run, something that actually kind of makes BB Can stand out in comparison to something like BBUS. But here you instantly get foreshadowing to an unexpected twist that Canada will hold the key to, it being the most sensational power of the season that will bring this house down, which I do find it funny how like they really act as if this twist ends up being something new and it's like essentially just a glorified coup d'etat. But here we also get the reveal of another twist to the season, that being that the house will be empty when they first enter. They'll have to earn basic necessities, and that nothing will come easy, which feels a very new era of them. And just like in a new era, I really don't care. Why are we focusing on this? But anyway, we get the first 6 players to enter here, where you do notice right away with this cast that this is an extremely young cast. I mean, 6 of the 16 players on this season end up being either 21 or 22. Only 3 of them end up being even in their 30s or above, where I would assume this has to be one of the youngest casts in all of North American Big Brother. But alongside that, we do also end up seeing a very large amount of superfans on this season, probably the most superfan heavy cast in the show's history, with only a couple that end up not being super familiar with the show. And again, just so many diehard fans here, to where because of that, the gameplay on this season ends up being very dynamic, with most players seeming to know what they're doing in the game, which is again kind of refreshing. So at the same time, I do feel like the show very clearly struggles to keep up with that, being this point where you can really start to tell this shift in the editing of the show to have largely inaccurate edits that, again, BB Can will kind of be known for in the upcoming seasons. But to me, this kind of feels like the start of it, this point where they start to not even try to genuinely show what happened, and more so pick their heroes from the very beginning and try to glorify them on the show and hype them up as much as they can, which on something like BB Can ends up being extremely harmful to the game, as again, BB Can's obviously a show that likes to have these twists that give Canada power, and through that it's essentially allowing production to decide what happens at points based on the way that they portray these players in the edit, which again I think is a very dangerous precedent to set. But anyway, the first group here ends up containing most of the season's biggest players. I mean, literally containing the final 4 plus Zach and Jordan, Zach being this football quarterback, though at the same time also being a massive super fan, and they clearly set up this like potential showmance for him with Ashley. Really gets hyped up as this like girl next door, saying that she'll use all of her assets and play up the sex role. And again, we get this like really provocative camera work in her intro, which again is all very strange if you know her background. But also we're getting introduced to Jordan, who instantly knocks over puzzle pieces and says that he'll be a manipulator and a liar and a backstabber. It says that he rubs people the wrong way if he doesn't like you, he'll tell you, which he doesn't proceed to do, where Jordan was, again, another massive super fan of the show, where I know he had read, like, Dan Giesling's book before the season, and was really playing up this, like, character of being this, like, massive conservative that was very outspoken, and that being, again, a strat that Dan used to get cast on Big Brother US, and it seemed to work for Jordan here on BB Can, where, like Dan, he ends up just completely changing his tune while on the season, but Jordan just having a vastly different reputation to what it seemed like he was initially hyped up to have here, where Jordan ended up being pretty notable outside the show. Beyond this, again, being a massive RGP fan while on the season, ended up like hosting podcasts on the feeds, leading to him actually becoming an RGP podcaster for the Happy Hour for a couple years. And while eventually ended up stopping after BB Can 5, he is someone that, again, was this massive name in the community back in the day. And again, it's just really humorous that this is his initial persona being set up here when, again, his reputation beyond this is just the polar opposite. Just no one having a bad word to say about Jordan Parhar within the alumni community. But also here we end up getting introduced to Godfrey, being set up as a professor of this game, and talks about his psychology degree, even though he's only 22. But he clearly ends up coming into this season feeling very overconfident and having like so many crazy schemes, where I remember actually I was pretty low on him coming into this season because of him having this like really insane plot where, I mean, even here we do see him instantly talk about how he's very anti-showmance, and playing into that he had this like weird idea coming into the season, bringing in this like fake wedding ring, and he was gonna like plant it in the luggage of a showmance and try to like split them up through it. And again, that's just such an insane strategy that, again, I never ended up seeing him attempt, which again, I don't know why, because it surely would have worked. So again, I ended up thinking he would play the game like way too hard at the beginning, though he ends up actually doing the complete opposite. He ends up actually probably playing a bit too passively early on, to where he ends up having a very quiet start, not really finding his footing until midway through the game, being very purple on the show, though obviously later on becomes one of the biggest players of the season. Oh, and then cut to Sarah, a hemployee, another massive super fan who literally enters the house referencing Tala by walking down the stairs backwards, saying that she wants to be the party girl and pretend that she doesn't want to win, which the show tries to make it seem like as if this is something that ends up working for her down the road, when like very clear is like the opposite. Like, people do not end up underestimating Sarah. People do actually look at her as a pretty massive threat moving forward, one that ends up essentially just stumbling her way to the end, her being obviously the biggest beneficiary of how twist heavy this season ends up being, alongside Brittany, a plus size model who gets some decent personal content from the very beginning here, talking about being self-conscious growing up and haven't been bullied, but obviously ends up being one of the big fan favorites of the season. Now with the next 5, we end up being introduced to Greg, Ginger Ninja 604 Propa, a baseball coach who says that his job helps him with getting along with everybody, which is obviously what Greg is exactly known for. But then we also get introduced to Neha, a chiropractor and self-proclaimed biggest Big Brother fan, who ends up being propped up post-show. It's like this Rob goddess, someone that does end up talking a pretty big game on the offset here, talking about being willing to cut her closest ally. Oh, and then cut to Willow, another massive super fan, where we even see her like taking cold showers to prep for being on slop. And we see her acting like so over the top and saying that she's a jack in a box, and also saying that she's going to find a man in the Big Brother house, which that doesn't age well. Oh, and then get to Johnny, who would have guessed it, another super fan. Well, I did love how he starts his intro here literally saying that don't make me the next Neil, which but he ends up talking about how he wants to play with the strength of Emmett and the strategy of Netta. And we also see him having a dog named Vito, where I remember Johnny, someone that I definitely thought had a lot of potential coming into this season. And then we get to Bruno, who is clearly like the season's family man, but also a big time gamer, where I remember at the time thinking of him as like the next coming of Derek, where again, this was coming off of Big Brother 16. And while it doesn't necessarily play out that way, I did remember there being a lot of hype around Bruno as a player throughout this season. And I remember I left this season thinking pretty highly of Bruno, though, I mean, we'll talk about it. But then we get to the final 5, getting our introduction to Kevin Martin, obviously one of the biggest names in Big Brother Canada, really one of the biggest names, I feel like, in social strategy Canadian shows, where obviously he has since then been on The Traitors, been on Amazing Race, and Kevin's obviously just incredible TV, though this is obviously his first appearance, and he has a very weird intro, where he does talk about how he can bluff anybody, and says the ladies love him, and that he loves cougars, and that when he sees a big pair of breasts, he just wants to motorboat them, which it's like, okay. And what do you know? We then cut to Risha, obviously being hyped up here as a cougar, a hot single woman that's confident, likes younger men, though also ends up actually getting a pretty sympathetic background on the offset here, talking about her parents having died when she was young, and she had to raise her younger sister, which sadly feels like the only content she really gets that isn't about her breasts. But then we also see Bobby, a rock climber who lives in his parents' basement, and I mean, he's kind of boring on the offset here, even though he ends up actually kind of being an insane player by the end. We also end up getting a laughing montage from Peely. Talks about having come from Mexico and moved to Canada 6 years ago, and because of that, she's good at adapting, I guess, because that's surely what Peely will be known for, is how well she adapted in the game of Big Brother. And finally, we get introduced to Cindy with an S, with her instantly telling us, don't get that wrong. And we see her being a beauty queen here, saying that she knows that she's pretty. And it's just a very weird intro from Cindy with an S. And again, I assume she's playing up a character. And we see her after entering the house, like instantly having a very awkward conversation, literally just telling everybody that she's Cindy with an S. And then we proceed to see Zach spelling out her name and Cindy with an S, saying, oh, you can spell. But we also see her saying that if you spell with a C, I'll kill you. And again, all this is just such a very bad way to introducing yourself in the game. Obviously making her a massive target from the offset, but also incredible character. Now, I will say, I remember I particularly hated Cindy with an S back in the day, back in my period of still actually caring about the likability of players. Like, I feel like Cindy is an S. She is one of these people that, again, really came off obviously very conceited, though obviously as time goes on, I mean, I could very much appreciate just what insane TV she was in this moment. But eventually, Arissa ends up going on the screen, revealing the first twist of the season, saying that there's no way to avoid blood on your hands. It's just like how Godfrey likes it. But you get the reveal that all of them are the HOH, which is probably not an apt comparison to this, considering if you're HOH, you're going to be safe. But either way, we get the reveal that each player gets to nominate 2 people, and the people with the most amount of votes by the end up going on the block, where we also later find out that this eviction isn't based on the typical eviction vote from the players themselves, or instead we'll get a public vote to decide who goes home. AKA, this just essentially being the original Big Brother format, which, I mean, I don't love. I mean, it's almost as if there's a reason why the original Big Brother format didn't work in North America. I think it's a very strange way of starting off the season here to have, again, right away, Canada deciding who goes home first. Though, obviously, considering BB Can's Perpetuity, to have a very twisty week 1 to make up for the fact that it ends up being condensed on the show into 2 episodes, with, again, one of those being the premiere where you have to set up so much within that. It's not shocking that they utilize a twist like this here, as, again, this does end up saving time by the end. Again, you don't have to waste the time on the live eviction vote, theoretically. Also, you could take out a formal HOH comp as well. Again, it saves time, it saves money as well in terms of you don't have to set up that comp. And at the same time, they don't really utilize that to the best of its ability, where obviously, like, instead of the HOH comp, we still do have to have this vote where, again, each player goes in one by one to select their nominees. Well, also, they end up mishandling their time at the end of the week anyway. But also, again, just in general, I don't like how this twist is handled here. First, the fact that obviously they have to end up voting here based on first impressions, allowing for lots of inherent biases to factor in to who gets nominated, where obviously I just don't think it gives certain people the opportunity to really change their fate here, but also ends up leaving the audience in charge of who goes home, with, again, the audience also barely even knowing who these people are, where, again, this public vote ends up happening immediately after this premiere episode, where you only get, like, what, minutes, if that, of these respective nominees, to where the concept of, again, someone on Big Brother just being eliminated from the offset just because of how they were portrayed in a very tiny portion of the premiere just feels dumb. And while to fair, it doesn't necessarily play out in that way, as really I feel like the result of this week would have been the same anyway. I mean, under most HOH reigns at least. I do think the fact that it could have played out in a way where someone that would have been safe otherwise is taken out due to Canada's vote on week 1, with them not having much opportunity to save themselves because the noms were decided hours into the game. Again, I think it's just kind of lame here. But along with that, I also think it's kind of unfair. And along with that, I also think it's really unfair, like the vote order and how that affects things as well, where, while we do see it end up being in alphabetical order, so at least there is, again, some method to the madness there. Theoretically, again, this does allow for time for the others to collaborate. And I'm sure there was some sort of rule that they couldn't talk while the voting was going on, but I do think this gives, like, a bit of an unfair advantage to those that end up going later in the order, while also being unfair for those that end up joining in the last group, where obviously the first and second groups got to know each other much better than those in the last group who end up joining at the last second. And we do end up seeing that playing a factor into the vote, where a bulk of the votes end up landing on those that come in that last group. Where again, we end up seeing Ashley being the first to vote here and proceeding to vote Risha, despite not knowing Risha's name and just calling her Tall Girl, which makes this even dumber. We see Kevin voting for the older, really good-looking lady, but again, obviously Risha ends up being an easy nomination here. Again, the oldest player of the season, also in that final group. We see Bruno getting a good chunk of votes here because he's older, aka 31. But we also see Godfrey and Peely getting votes for no real explained reason. We see Bobby and Zach getting votes here for what I assume are because they're physical threats. But obviously the other nom ends up being Cindy with an S, with over half of the house ending up voting for her, getting the most amount of votes of the entire cast, which again makes sense considering how annoying she came off as. But immediately we end up getting to the veto pick and a subsequent veto comp, which did really feel very rushed here, as obviously they did need to make these nominations final by the end of the episode to allow for the vote, to where again it really felt like they were breezing through all this. But we do end up getting a pretty terrible pick for the nominations here, with 3 strong men being picked here, and Bobby, Kevin, and Zach. What ends up being a pretty physical veto comp that has them again transferring puzzle pieces back and forth across a cargo net, and then solving a puzzle, and then proceeding to crack a code, which, I mean, the comp itself was again pretty boring. And we do end up seeing Risha just really struggling throughout the entirety of this. So we see the men get the lead to the puzzle. Who would have guessed that? Though Kevin ends up being the only guy to finish the puzzle itself, alongside Cindy with an S, getting to the code, where I'll say the code itself was really stupid. The fact that it was literally just random. It was literally just them plugging in different numbers and having to guess. Again, there was no prompt on what the code could be, but it does lead to Cindy with an S pulling out the win here, to which we then get an immediate veto ceremony, where obviously she takes herself off, but we also get the reveal here that the veto winner also gets to pick the replacement nominee, which again essentially makes this a diamond power veto, which is very strange for week 1. But I'll say I don't actually hate this in this position, where again there's not a formal HOH. Again, theoretically you could have just gone to the next person in line with the votes to determine who goes up, though again I think that would have been pretty lame. Again, just further perpetuating this house consensus, where at least here against an individual player having to get blood in their hands, but also making a more personalized decision here. Again, which again I think is an interesting spot to put him in, even though again it might feel a bit overpowered on paper. But here we do have seeing her nominate Pila. I mean, she means Peely. Again, she doesn't even know her name, despite the fact she also ended up nominating her before during the original nomination vote. But we do see here Jordan really scolding Cindy Finesse for this choice. Why didn't she go for a big physical threat? And while I will very rarely ever defend Cindy Finesse as a player on BB Can 3, I don't actually think this is that bad of a move here, as again, you really just don't know what's happening here. Again, this is a spot where this is before they had any time to really strategize at all. You don't know any of these people's relationships. And through I think taking the more conservative approach here of nominating someone like Peely, someone that, again, very unlikely to win a comp to retaliate against you. Also, just in general, seems like a very nice person, where not really the most vengeful person, where again, I think nominating her over against someone like a Zach or a Bobby, who's very likely to win a comp to retaliate against you in the case that they stay, which again, you don't know if they're going to stay or not. Again, I do think playing the more conservative route is the better call, but let's take us to episode 2, which starts with Cindy Finesse talking about how she's safe with an S. So thank God. But we do end up wasting a lot of time here on them complaining about having no supplies, how to sleep on the floor and eat slop, which again was so boring. Yet again, clearly producers think this is funny, but we end up getting to a task that they have to complete to get their supplies, them getting 5 massive balloons that they have to keep above the ground for 5 hours, for them to get a number for the code to the vaults, leading to a very notable moment here from Kevin of him being tasked to sabotage and pop one of the balloons, Kevin being picked here, making it pretty clear that he's already a pretty big production favorite, with him getting a massive focus in the edit across the season and becoming a pretty massive fan favorite, really off the bat, to where a lot of focus here on his schemes to pop the balloon, which he eventually does do. And while the show does show him initially getting off this pretty clean, the reality is that most people did know what he was doing here. And this did seem to actually affect his game, where it did seem like people were genuinely just kind of sketched out by him due to this situation. And again, I think that really just shows the negatives of having these sort of tasks in a social strategy game. For a while, again, some of these can lead to fun TV. This isn't necessarily something I ever particularly wanted translated over to Big Brother US, as again, I think it's kind of this big like power imbalance between players and what production clearly wants them to do. Again, Kevin could have technically declined this offer here, but in doing so, obviously he'll be upsetting production. Also be disappointing the audience, where a game like BB Can, where again the audience has a lot to say, I do think this is essentially just goading Kevin into worsening his social standing for the sake of making a TV moment, which again I don't particularly love. But also along the way, we do get some setup to some pretty important relationships for down the road, us seeing right away the Johnny-Kevin relationship, which ends up being a very weird dynamic with Johnny having a crush on Kevin, and the show essentially just turning Johnny, again, this like super fan and again, a competent enough player, into this guy who's just fawning over Kevin constantly, where he really becomes this one-dimensional character in the edit who really only talks about Kevin whenever he's shown, which again is kind of disappointing considering the fact that he is somebody that actually has a pretty interesting personality on his own, right? And again, did have some pretty good strategic instincts at points. But also here we get the setup to Zach and Jordan's alliance, which they later end up calling Newport, which ends up being a pretty dominant duo during the early portions of this season, being these two massive super fans attempting to do the Chilltown / Renegade / Shield type thing of being this duo, playing the middle, trying to secretly work together in lockstep. And it really did seem like production was going all in on them in this point, seeming to have a lot of confidence in them as players, especially because they're introducing them in this premiere week in a spot where they had very little time to utilize, where again, they were primed for success from the offset here, though obviously end up having some pretty colossal mistakes that end up taking that position. But eventually we get the conclusion of the balloon task, where we do see them now need to crack the code to open the vaults, aka just also randomly trying out combinations, which was boring. But we end up seeing Jordan and Zach being the ones to solve it. Good for them. And once inside, they find all the furnishings, which they have to put in place themselves, with all of them coming from the brick, and this essentially just being a glorified brick commercial. Again, also boring. This is when we start to get focused around Risha, with her clearly being on the outs and primed to be going home here. She does talk about how she needs to bond with the girls and flirt with the guys. To immediately see her trying to flirt with Kevin, only for it to be very awkward and Kevin just openly saying that this isn't working. And this is followed up by Risha's probably most notable scene of the season, of her taking her top off in the hot tub, with Kevin talking about how huge her boobs are and Ashley saying that she wished she had boobs like that. And again, this is just so weird. Again, like Johnny, just feeling like this very one-dimensional portrayal being put on Risha here in a spot where, again, like just the previous episode, again, she had this very sympathetic background. Yet at this point, again, they just simply reduce her to her boobs, and that's essentially what she ends up being remembered for on this season. And while I do end up feeling really bad for Risha in this spot, I do think there were a lot of signs here to the fact that she was probably not a particularly good player, and the fact that we see most of the cast gathering for a yoga class, only for us to just cut to her being alone, being annoyed at them playing Kumbaya, really just seeming to isolate herself, where again, it did seem like Risha's only ally here was Cindy with Finesse, which is obviously not a great ally to have. And in general, clearly Risha was going home no matter what here, even if there was a proper vote, where Risha never really seemed to stand a chance here, which does end up making the way that she does end up going home here feel that much more like them just kicking her when she's down, where we obviously get to the live eviction, where we do get the reveal of the public vote to the players themselves, where again, they did not know this was happening until the last second, which I do think is a bit unfair here, obviously, as it's, again, them spending the entire week isolating Risha, assuming that she's going home, only for her to have a chance of staying just because of a last-second twist, which, again, I get it from a TV perspective. Obviously, you don't want the players having no incentive to really be strategizing at this point if there's no upcoming eviction, where, again, it does make for better TV to do this. Yeah, I do think, again, it's a bit unfair to the players themselves, even though it doesn't really work out in that way anyway. Also, I did find it very strange how they end up having Peely and Risha to pick up their envelopes from the vaults. These envelopes that contain the results of the eviction vote, to which we end up wasting the time of them walking over to the vault, trying to find their boxes, which they struggle to even do there. Again, like, you just felt like this was just wasting time on the show in a spot where, like, you would think that that was the point of doing this twist, is to, again, save time on the show in a very packed premiere week, to where, again, like, why did you just add this segment here for no reason? Again, I do really feel for Risha in this spot. Again, making it seem like she has a shot for a second here, only for that to just be shut down once again, where you see Risha being evicted over Peely, where I do remember actually at the time this happening being pretty surprised at this, where again, I was personally rooting for Risha. I felt like she was someone that was obviously a bigger fan, someone that was going to play harder than Peely, who I thought was just kind of boring, and as we see plays out, she doesn't really do too much on the season. So again, I was personally surprised by this result, though considering the way that this vote was handled, again, the fact that it was a vote to evict, and it was a position where, again, Peely was barely in the premiere episode, Risha was kind of all over it, and it being a spot where I don't think either of them really had this lasting impact on the audience, to where I think, again, the fact that the person that gets voted out here is the person we saw more of, there's more opinions to be had of her. I think this is actually a world where the renom is probably safer in most situations here, just considering the fact that, again, they're probably not going to be shown as much as someone that wasn't nominated initially, to where, and I think because that Risha gets kind of unfortunate how this vote ends up resulting, as again, I remember there being a pretty big pro Risha sentiment at the time, to the point where even Arissa even mentions the Save Risha campaign in the episode. Yeah, again, it all ends up being for naught. But despite that, we do also get the reveal at the end of the episode here that thanks to KFC, one of the first few boots will end up having the opportunity to come back into the game. Which again, there's so much wrong with this, but again, we'll talk about that later. But with that, again, we end up losing Risha, who is someone that, again, I feel bad for. I mean, she's a massive fan of the show, was so excited to be there, and just kind of gets sniped out at the very beginning here, with her not really being given a chance. Again, I think she's someone that was simply nominated from the offset because she's the oldest person on this cast. I think also because she's the oldest person on this cast, she very much struggled to relate to a lot of the people around her. And while, again, I think she would have likely been the first boot of the season in most given situations anyway, I do feel like she's someone that, again, had some potential if she was given a better cast for her. Yeah, instead she ends up being on, again, one of the youngest casts in Big Brother history, and through that, it didn't feel like she was given much leeway here. Yeah. And again, I also feel bad for her portrayal in the show, where, I mean, she's really just a one-dimensional character for the most part, just getting screen time about her breasts. So again, I think it's a very weird run for Risha here. I mean, considering again how big of a fan she was, she's someone that I wish was given more of a chance on this season. But now moving on to week 2, somehow one of the only non-twisty weeks of the season, where we do get a pretty interesting HOH comp here, again it being an endurance one, pretty similar to Chimney Sweep from Survivor, of them having to stand between two walls with two small footholds, though they do end up having a rope to help them for most of it, though we do end up seeing players throwing as expected on a cast of super fans that were inspired by Dan and Will, where we do end up seeing Brittany genuinely dropping first, only for Kevin then proceed to drop out after Greg says that someone needs to give her a hug, which again was such a see-through move here, which again doesn't help his perception here, and finally ends up backfiring on him. Oh, we see Newport also ending up throwing, because that's what they do, but again, this ends up being a moment used in the edit here to hype up Sarah as a great player, because she notices that Jordan and Zach are throwing, which most people should. And mixing out the fact that we also saw her like sussing Kevin back after he popped the balloon. Again, it's already giving Sarah a lot of credit for things that don't really matter and should be pretty obvious. I mean, she is somebody that does notice when people are being manipulative. The problem is that she just kind of assumes that everyone's being manipulative at all times, where again, it's not necessarily like she gets an accurate read all the time. It's more so just that she always is suspicious of everything. But anyway, the comp comes down to Bobby and Cindy finesse, with this really being a comp made for Bobby here, being a rock climber, and he does obviously end up winning here, essentially being in the position of the first HOH of the season. Again, a pretty powerful position that he will surely use to the best of his benefit. But also here we get the reveal that the first 8 out of the HOH will also participate in the Have Not competition, which actually ends up being a pretty fun comp here. Again, one composed of 1v1 matchups of going back and forth and putting buckets of slop on a beam, though you could throw balls at your opponent's buckets and knock them over. And again, this is a fun little challenge here, though as expected, we see Jordan again hamming up his throwing, while Kevin decides to throw as well, only for Brittany to just suck so bad that he ends up winning anyway. Here we also get the reveal to Have Not room, which is literally just an empty room that looks like a prison. Though an interesting aspect of it is that there is a siren that goes off, with the reveal that it's based around a sensor in the middle of the room, which also ends up being pretty cool foreshadowing there. Again, something I do actually like from this season. There was always reason to believe that there was some sort of power in the Have Not room, though again, sadly, the way it ends up being divvied out ends up not being as interesting. But in terms of the alliances, we do get the reveal here of the Chop Shop, an alliance of Greg, Bruno, Bobby, Zach, Willow, and Ashley, which ends up being this initial majority alliance that typically see on any given season of Big Brother. Again, very much feeling inspired by the Bomb Squad or the first 5, and them having, again, a lot of control early on in the season, though also one that was never really poised for success, to where while most of the alliance members seem loyal initially here, they did have a weak link that would have always doomed this alliance in the long term, that being Zach, who was never really buying into this alliance, and was really just buying his time to be taking out the likes of Greg and Bruno, while also he ends up instantly exposing this alliance to Jordan, with Zach and JP ending up playing both sides against each other from the very beginning here. Also, we get talk from Bobby about wanting to build up this persona that he isn't playing the game, so he gets no blood on his hands. And him going so far into this persona to where it really ends up actually being a detriment to his game. To him continuously playing dumb and saying that he doesn't want to talk game to the people that he isn't close to, which again just ruins the benefits of being this HOH. Again, you're supposed to be gathering info, gaining influence, but instead he's just turning people away. And we do see people seeing through this as well. We see Neha calling him out for this, and also noticing that he's constantly having conversations with the likes of Zach and Bruno and Greg. And again, the way Bobby plays this ends up being pretty poorly, and the Chop Shop in general ends up being kind of an obvious alliance the most. But we do see Bobby saying that Kevin and Johnny scare him the most, where, I mean, the reality is that Kevin and Johnny were never even that close strategically. Again, they are looked at as a massive target at this point, both probably being the best competitors outside of the Chop Shop alliance. And through that, we end up seeing Bobby create his plan for the week, that being to nominate the first two out of the HOH comp in Brittany and Kevin, with obviously Kevin as the target, though again he's able to do so in a way that again gets blood off his hands, that he can just act like he's playing fair. And again, this is a really funny ramification of Kevin throwing that initial HOH comp, where again, to be fair, like Kevin was probably going to be the target no matter what anyway, but the fact that this just gave them this easy excuse to put him on the block in this spot is kind of funny, where again we get the nominations, where we do actually get a new addition for this season in the short list, where the HOH has the name for potential nominees. That is simply just for the show. Again, the players themselves don't see this. And it's really just this opportunity on the show for them to talk through the potential nominees. Though in the same light, it does feel extremely manufactured here, as, again, it just wastes time on the show. As, again, there's many points where the HOH never is genuinely considering 4 nominees. So the fact that they have to give these BS excuses for why this person's on the short list ends up being kind of dumb. But it more so just feels like the producers kind of feeding you their story more so than this actually being genuine insight from the player themselves. But also here we get another addition. The fact that way nominations are made here is through a steampunk contraption that reveals the nominees, which is again a nice little touch to connect to the aesthetic theme of the season that ends up being continued on seasons down the road. Again, I feel like one of these things that just feels like a step above BBUS, where you just have them very awkwardly turning the keys, where again this feels like that on again a little bit bigger of a scale. But again, Brittany and Kevin end up being nominated here, with Brittany starting her long trajectory of being the perpetual pawn of the season. Though this is when we do get to a pretty big moment in the season, where we cut to the HOH room, where all the girls have gathered together, with Cindy, Finesse, leading the talk here, saying that they need to keep female numbers and make sure that they don't put up a new female, which, I mean, the constant use of female here was kind of weird. But and this is seeing the likes of Cindy, Finesse, Neha, Sarah, all actively working together here, talking about wanting to save Brittany and take out Kevin. Everything seems fine until Kevin leaves the HOH bathroom, with the reveal that he was listening in the entire time. And we also get this like really funny reaction from the women here, realizing that he can now use this against them, and finally starts this new meta for future seasons of people checking the bathroom before game talks to make sure no one's listening in. But again, this does end up kickstarting Kevin's campaign here, again allowing him to utilize this information to his benefit. Again leaking to Greg initially about an all-women's alliance forming, who was again the perfect person to tell, as obviously he was going to spread this throughout the entire house and act very emotionally and wanting to retaliate immediately, going to the women saying that they made a big mistake and that there wasn't a Gaia's alliance, but there is now, which again obviously incredible gameplay from Greg. But also we see him leading the charge now into wanting to save Kevin with the veto to backdoor one of Cindy, Finesse, or Neha. The two Kevin predominantly ends up throwing under the bus. Again, a really quick turnaround here for Kevin in a spot where again I do think he plays it well. Now at the end of the day, he didn't really need the information in the bathroom to do this. I think he could have just like pretended like he heard this somewhere and it still would have the same effect. But again, I do think he really makes the most out of this situation. Despite all the good work that Kevin does end up doing here, it doesn't end up really mattering, as we get to the veto, where Kevin wins the veto in what ends up being a beaver-inspired challenge of them having to transport logs with letters on them, solve a word puzzle, a really physical challenge with the mental portion. I can't believe someone like Kevin Martin would win a challenge like that. But again, it comes down to Cindy or Neha as the renom, with Sarah talking about trusting Neha, with us getting to see now the Sarah and Neha relationship, and her proceeding to throw Cindy, Finesse, under the bus as if she had any impact, actually getting Cindy, Finesse over Neha, where again just another spot where the edit feels like has to give Sarah for credit for things that don't really matter. But obviously Neha ends up being her initial ride or die here, to where obviously once she goes, it kind of transitions over to Brittany, like emphasis on the kind of, as even by the end of this week, we do see her very much considering taking out Brittany over Cindy. Finesse with her getting content talking about how Brittany's head isn't in the game and Cindy would be a better ally, which is an opinion that Sarah continues to have across the season despite Brittany's undying loyalty to her, which is funny considering them now being looked at as this ride or die duo. Also, I do find it funny this entire situation is like really the main suspense on whether or not Cindy's going to stay or not is, again, Sarah deciding on who to take out when Sarah had, again, no power to save Cindy Finesse, even if she wanted to. But and despite Cindy Finesse ending up being the replacement nom and being primed to go home here, no real chance to save herself, we do also end up seeing Neha becoming a massive target of her own across the week, again being looked at as the brains of the operation, to where she ends up being a pretty near consensus target for the following week. And to add to that, we actually do see some interesting gameplay here from Bruno and Greg, who decided to spread rumors to try to split up Brittany and Neha, telling Brittany that Neha's campaigning against her, which again doesn't end up mattering. But I did like seeing the usage of proactive lies here, though at the same time it does get back to Neha, and it ends up putting more of a target on Greg's back, though again there always was one anyway. Now beyond that, we do get some tasks across the week. One that was kind of fun of them having to rank each other amongst the least on different attributes, with Johnny having to guess what they are ranking it on, which again, fun task here that exposed some social dynamics here, where we do see Sarah and Kevin being labeled as the smartest and being annoyed at that, along with Jordan also being at the top of that, also while being labeled as the most likely to win, which annoys him, while Godfrey is able to escape all of that, being at the bottom of both questions, which really shows his ability to lessen his threat level, though at the same time, he kind of does it too well. Anyway, through this, we end up getting a pool party where they play Spin the Battle, where Johnny gets to kiss Zach and Kevin and says that his dreams are coming true. Oh, we see Zach and Ashley kiss. With the Showmance is getting a lot of content across this week, and really just in general, again, this was a very Showmance heavy season. Again, we see Zach talking about, we can't hook up with Ashley yet, as it closes the door of Brittany and Willow. It says that Jordan's keeping his mind straight, only for him to still hook up with Ashley, and for Jordan then hook up with Cindy Finesse, which also really comes out of nowhere. But also, because we need more showmances, we also get the focus on the Kevin Peely showmance, weirdly through the perspective of Johnny, with him being heartbroken that Kevin leaves his bed, this cuddle with Peely, which is again all a very strange edit there. But also here we end up seeing Jordan and Kevin starting an alliance, calling themselves the Fortress, and make up a symbol, which ends up being Kevin's genuine alliance throughout the early portion of the season, only for Jordan to say it's more about Newport, which works out for him. Here we also get another segment about the players realizing that they have no hot showers and no food in the pantry, with BB revealing that this is a punishment for someone damaging a camera in the middle of the night, which we never get the reveal of who did it, because clearly no one did it, and they revealed it's a prank at the end of the week, to where why'd they do this? Like, I really find it strange how BB Can just does this sometimes, of just like lying about something that happened and then deciding to punish the players on that, just to instigate drama. Again, it feels just very manufactured, though. We do end up seeing a fight actually coming out of this, with Godfrey calling out Cindy, Finesse calling her the fakest person here, with Godfrey hyping this up as part of his strategy to make people know that he'll put them on blast, which, like, I don't get how that's beneficial. Like, I feel like that just adds to his persona of being this very emotional player, and really just makes him look like someone hard to work with and someone that's unhinged, where again, I don't think this was a particularly good play. But anyway, we get to the live eviction, where it ends up obviously being a unanimous Cindy Finesse vote, with all the Chop Shop members doing the Chop Shop symbol outside of Zach, who does Newport alongside Jordan, while Kevin does the Fortress, which is all really funny. But again, we lose Cindy Finesse until we don't, so talk about her later. But then we get to week 3, which starts off with an instant eviction. Why? I mean, I get that they want to eliminate more players early on to increase the pool of players for the buyback competition. But also, it's like, why do they think an instant eviction is the best way of handling that? With, again, obviously this greatly favoring the majority, to where there isn't time to really change the status quo. And to make matters worse, the HOH comp here ends up being the knockout comp, which just adds even more power to the majority, to where, while, again, knockout comp is fun and can lead to these really underdog moments, it is still something that does favor the majority. But again, we do see Neha putting on a pretty good performance here, getting picked over and over and over again, and getting them right, only for her to end up losing to Ashley towards the end of the comp, with Ashley herself getting the final question wrong, giving Kevin the HOH. despite him not wanting it and trying to throw it the entire time. And we do see him being frustrated that he's going to be looked at as a comp beast, which is surely a reputation that Kevin would be able to avoid. But again, it is really funny that we see Kevin instantly being told to go to the vault, and we see him just being very annoyed the entire time. It is here where he's told that he has 5 minutes to decide who he's nominating. And who would have guessed that he nominates the status quo of targeting Neha and putting Brittany up as a pawn? I can't believe it. But strangely, after making these noms, they just let Kevin go back to the house, and he's told to wait until BB reveals what's going on. He's not able to expose his nominations, where all this is just really dumb. Like, I don't get why they just made him make noms right away. I guess to them, that's part of the format of the instant eviction, but I think it would have been a lot better had he, again, been able to talk to some people and decide to make noms after that, or do the opposite of, again, if you can't do the instant eviction right away, at least, like, sequester him. It's just very strange for them to just put him back into the house in a spot where he has to lie about everybody about not having made noms yet. But also, it's like, why do they want this? Like, don't they want people to have the chance of changing things up? Like, this is just, again, keeping the status quo and giving the people that go out here almost no real chance to save themselves. Or we do end up seeing Neha do some pretty good work in the meantime, and making Kevin consider actually going with her side over the likes of Bruno, Greg, and Bobby. Oh, well, we do also see Jordan pull him into alliance with Zach, which they call the Bermuda Triangle. So that's something. But again, they were going to try to play the middle. And we do see Jordan and Zach actually push for Kevin to not nominate Neha here, as she's a shield for them. Which again, at least opens it up to where, again, something different could have happened here. Now, I know Kevin has said post-show that this wouldn't have changed anything, that he still probably would have targeted Neha, even if he didn't make those noms early. The fact that all this like newfound information here couldn't be factored into his nominations is, again, just kind of lame. And obviously there is the question if this is the right call to make. And I actually think it's a pretty tough decision for Kevin at this point, where again, it's just obviously tough, the fact that he even won this one in particular. But he was in this spot where he was starting to make inroads with the guys. The guys weren't planning on targeting him right away. Again, they were talking about using him as a weapon. Obviously, he was still disposable to them for the long term. Oh, while it did seem like the Neha side had people that he generally wanted to work with. Though, I think an issue with that side is the fact that he's pretty much the biggest target on that side. Wherever he ends up flipping in that spot, he probably once again becomes the biggest target for the opposition. To where, again, I do think it's a tough choice here. However, I do think knowing that Jordan and Zach were backing him in this spot and protecting Neha, I probably would have been more inclined to go the opposite way than what he actually did. Or at least try to go and play the middle and not necessarily do the chop shop's bidding. Just keep both sides to go after each other. But either way, I do think he's in a pretty flexible position after this, to where I don't feel like this choice really ends up being that detrimental to his game. But again, the players are eventually called to the living room, where we do see Brittany and Neha being nominated, to where we see each player having to write down their vote in the vaults for some reason, mainly because they wanted to do a public vote reveal also for some reason. But again, I didn't love this, as it really just, again, allows for there being easy scapegoats. Beyond this, now fully knowing who didn't vote in the majority. But again, either way, like, Neha's clearly going home here. We do get some intrigue from Sarah and Johnny ending up voting for Brittany, which again further isolates them and opens up the possibility of upsetting Brittany for no reason, where I really don't understand why they did this. And again, it just feels like a completely emotional move, and who would have guessed that one of the many bad moves Sarah makes across this season. But here we do end up seeing Greg voting for Neha, calling her the new Netta. In fact, you're better than Netta. Which, not the only hyperbolic statement he says, as he also ends up saying that Kevin's playing the best Big Brother game of all time. But either way, Neha ends up being evicted here as expected. And again, I think it's sad to lose Neha in this spot, where, again, it feels like she was sniped out of the game. Realistically, again, Neha's probably going home this week anyway. I don't think it really changed that much. But again, Neha's someone that, again, seemed to have a lot of potential, a super fan of the show, very strategic. Mind you, someone that I think it would be very tough to really hide how strategic she is, where unless her side were to get a majority from the very beginning, I think she wouldn't be long for the game in most given situations. But someone that, again, did seem to have a lot of potential, and someone that it's kind of sad that we never got to see her play again, as again, definitely felt like a short run here. Still one that was, again, worth seeing her back at some point down the road. But then we get to the rest of week 3, which obviously ends up being slightly condensed due to the instant. But right away, we do see Sarah being upset, as now Brittany's gonna hate her, and she has this meltdown with Willow and Jordan, saying that she knows she didn't make a good move, which, like, obviously. Again, we do see Brittany forgiving her, and really, it's like, what other options does Brittany have? But again, it takes us to HOH comp, a weirdly formatted one, and us getting another endurance HOH, but one played in pairs, where you have to stand on top of a gear together, and the pair that lasts the longest wins, which I do like this comp, as it's not one that's, like, particularly difficult. It's one that is largely just, like, who wants it the most. Now, obviously, there is a factor factor of like who your partner is and how big they are and how that affects like your ability to stand on the peg. But something else I did like here is the fact that they actually did allow the players to choose their partners, which again does help with that. But also I'll say again, like, why are we doing this? I don't know why they decided to do a challenge in pairs at the HOH. Again, this feels very random, but also as they drop, we end up seeing the players have to take a box where one of the people in the pair will get whatever is inside, which obviously just leads to us getting some typical punishments from the likes of Ashley and Jordan having to wear snorkeling gear where for some reason they decided to just do it together. We end up seeing Johnny having to get pied throughout the day, leading to him saying that he's getting creamed by all the boys, which is again such a cringy thing to say on TV. While Willow has to stand on a gear for 24 hours. Again, all these not particularly interesting. But shockingly, we see Brittany and Sarah ending up being paired here. And what do you know? They win. Again, this obviously being this typical underdog win. Again, going from the block to the top, with this obviously being a perfect time for them to win HOH, allowing for the opportunity to turn the game in their favor, with Brittany in particular ending up taking the HOH here. But again, this ends up being the perfect time for them to win HOH, allowing for the opportunity for them to turn the game into their favor. Talking about how the women are getting picked off, and trying to unify the women together during this round. We do see the likes of like an Ash, a Willow, a Peely, again, making strives to separate themselves from the Chop Shop side of things, which again, considering the later HOH result, it does lead to the Chop Shop largely disintegrating despite the concept of this girls' alliance never being one that fully forms. But we do see Brittany and Sarah calling themselves the fembots here. They're all circuitry and wires, because we needed a Dr. Will reference. But they instantly have their sights on Greg as the person who called out the women the previous week and clearly came off as the least likely to work with women beyond this, and someone that they just don't like. Where we do end up seeing another tiff here between Greg and Sarah, with Sarah leaving the conversation, calling him a bully, which again, I do think Greg is a bit of a dick. Definitely talks in a very intense way. But again, I did feel like the description of being a bully was particularly unfair, especially because it's not like he's doing anything personal to any of these people. Though this ends up weirdly being the cliffhanger for the first episode of the week, or the rest of the week ends up just being rushed through because of the instant. And I couldn't get to the noms by the end of the episode because we needed to focus on such a master plan. But again, just a very strange spot to end this episode on. But again, we start the next episode with talk about this master plan to take out Greg, which, I mean, do you need a master plan to take out Greg? But here we see them decide to backdoor Greg, which, fine, I guess. Again, not really necessary, as it's Greg, who's not really the best competitor in the world, but also not the worst thing in the world, where almost everybody was on board with this backdoor, where, again, we see the women at the Chop Shop saying that they want a guy gone, and do finally end up seeing mastermind in it for Brittany, her saying that I need to pull in Zach and JP to make this plan go through, despite the fact that they were already on board, where obviously they're happy to get rid of Greg here with no blood on their hands. But again, the most questionable part of this master plan comes from the next step of the plan, in that they also decide to further blindside Greg through convincing him that the back door is actually on Johnny, with Brittany really playing up her annoyances at him for voting for her, which again seemed like no one should believe this, though who would have guessed it? Greg does for a while. So that's something. But realistically, this doesn't end up mattering. And Greg was going home anyway. But the show really likes to hype this up as this masterclass from Brittany and Sarah, where again, it really doesn't do much for them. But again, we get to the noms, where they end up nominating Bobby and Kevin, the two that had nominated her, which, again, sure. Again, just easy explanation. Also two really physical people that would probably win the veto. So here we do proceed to see her give this like really over-the-top speech about how she'll never forget people writing her name down, which again clearly makes sense when your closest ally at this point is Sarah, someone that also wrote your name down. But again, Greg ends up thinking nothing of this and really ends up being portrayed, as this big downfall for Greg, with JP talking about him being an idiot, and we see JP celebrating with Sarah and Brittany that Greg actually bought it. But finally, this leads to Greg talking to Brittany and really just scolding her for making an amateur play and that she should have gone for Johnny right away, which is a pretty insane moment there, just showing how aloof he was here. But anyway, we get to the veto pick, which ends up being pretty perfect for the plan here, with Johnny, Sarah, and Zach all being picked, all people that would end up using the veto. With Johnny talking about instantly wanting to use it on Kevin, and we get talk about how Johnny can be a comp threat, and who would have guessed that he goes on to win the veto, which actually ends up being a really physical one of them having to unspool 3 spools of thread, which has them spinning around over and over and over again, where again, this ends up being a really tough challenge where we see almost everyone getting extremely nauseous, and we see Sarah ending up quitting the challenge. challenge after tying the spool too tight around their chests. But again, it does end up coming down to Kevin and Johnny, aka Kevin's getting off the block, to where we do proceed to see Kevin essentially quit the challenge by the end, which I don't know if that was purposely him throwing or him just being kind of over the challenge itself. But either way, Johnny ends up winning here, which ends up just increasing the target on his back and really just showing him as this really massive physical threat. For while he was on the bottom of the totem pole either way, I do think his win here, doing so in such an impressive way, really does him no favors, as everyone was going to use the veto anyway, and he did not have to go this hard for this veto, to where it just makes him an even bigger bullseye for the opposition the following round. But again, with this Johnny win, it does finally click to Greg now that he's the target, where we do see him noticing that Johnny is hanging out with the girls a lot, and we do see him starting to scramble here, telling Bruno that he's going up, with Bruno seemingly not picking up on what's happening here, which is kind of weird. But we do end up seeing Greg confronting Brittany, only for her to let up the act, kind of, again, letting Greg in the fact that he is going up, but strangely blaming it on Johnny, saying that she heard about Greg calling her an emotional player, making it seem like Johnny manipulated her into doing this, and again, just making Brittany actually look like an emotional player, to where, and I really don't know what Brittany's intentions were here, as she looks in the confessional as if like she's trying to not come off as an emotional player, but by doing this, you're making yourself look more like one. But also, again, this obviously puts a bigger bullseye on Johnny, where you see Greg giving Johnny all the credit for this move, despite the fact that Johnny didn't have that much to do with it. But again, we see him telling Johnny good play, and this leads to a big fight between the two, with Johnny seemingly playing into this story that he convinced Brittany, saying that he was going out of the game, which is like, no, you're not. Like, why are you doing this? But again, I think this did happen. I mean, Greg did make this comment. Johnny did relay this to Brittany. But again, why are we acting as if this is actually the thing that convinced Brittany to go after Greg when she was going to go after Greg anyway? But anyway, we get to the veto ceremony, which is actually a pretty interesting one, where Johnny ends up obviously using the veto on Kevin, and again, ends up calling Greg a bully, to which Greg's response to this is saying that if people think it was bullying, that's on them, which is probably not the greatest response there. But again, he is the renom, to which he ends up saying, hashtag Ginger Ninja, hashtag 604, peace. That's Greg for you. But here we do end up getting some focus around Bruno, who essentially has his two closest allies on the block against each other. And we do see him initially wanting to keep Bobby around, though ends up actually changing his tune by the end of the week, to where he ends up wanting to keep Greg, which is kind of funny, as we do get this like initial red herring that Zach and Ashley want Bobby out, to split up Bobby and Bruno, only for Bruno to then campaign to them about wanting Bobby out. Again, Bruno going pretty hard here and trying to campaign for Greg, going to Ashley, Zach, and JP, which I did feel like was sticking his neck out a bit too much here, as again, there's not really much benefit either way. Like, again, both Bobby and Greg are loyal to him, both Bobby and Greg are bigger targets than him, and I actually feel like Bobby is at least like a more like stable strategic ally than Greg, to where, again, I don't personally know why he decided to do this, but again, it just opens up the opportunity for this to get back to Bobby and completely severing their relationship, to where I don't think this is the right call. But before the eviction, we do get a task of them having to find t-shirts around the house, because we needed an OxyClean sponsored challenge, which again, we certainly won't see again. But the winner here ends up getting $1,000 and also advantage in the HOH comp, to where we end up seeing Zach win, which I assume he did because of the money, but also, again, feels very opposed to Zach's typical style of just throwing competitions. And what do you know, his advantage here doesn't end up mattering anyway. Here we get to the eviction, where Greg says that it's unfair for me to be called a bully, and says that he hopes that Johnny comes to grips with his own insecurities. Namaste. But also here we have an interesting pitch from Bobby, him saying that his HOH was damaging to him and he will not be going for HOHs anymore if they keep him, where again, this just has him continuing to play up this like kind of meek persona, where we also had like seen him earlier in the week, like being fake emotional after the instant eviction, only then celebrate immediately afterwards, which again is funny, but again, just feels like such an ineffective strategy when just everyone knows that he's doing it. But again, we get a unanimous Greg vote, where Greg ends up getting up before arrest is even done and just leaves, saying Ginger Ninja 604 proper, because... And I did love this moment of like Arista telling him that you'll have an opportunity to come back to the game, and his instant response is, I don't even know if I want back in the house, which again, a funny exit from Greg. And again, Greg's someone that I thought was fun TV. I mean, obviously, again, there's some things with Greg that don't come off particularly well, but I do think Greg is someone that again just feels like this typical like outspoken pseudo leader of this initial majority alliance that gets toppled early on. Again, kind of like the likes of like a Tom and an Andrew. Mind you, I do feel like Greg actually probably does the least of those, where I feel like those two had pretty massive edits. Greg is kind of more in the background for most of it until really his boot week here. But still, he's a very notable character to me. Again, and him constantly just calling himself the Ginger Ninja is just, again, is just so ridiculous. And he's obviously very confrontational, where again, he does bring a lot to the show, though he was kind of clearly just over it by the end, where he is also just, again, a pretty bad player and someone that probably has no real potential in any given season. Now for week 4, where we get to the HOH, it being a OxyClean sponsored challenge. Can't believe that. It ends up being a super physical obstacle course here that has them having to go through the course 17 times, which was really brutal, with them getting a new letter every time to spell out the term fight dirty laundry, I guess. But Zach ends up getting a 1-letter head start to him winning that previous comp. That doesn't matter, despite the fact that he did seem to be genuinely trying here. But we do instead see Bruno win this HOH with the help of Godfrey, who does end up handing him some letters, which I know was some controversy at the time, and the fact that people did think that this was against the rules, as again, we've literally seen in the past, Emmett got disqualified in a veto comp due to helping Jillian, where again, this did seem very wonky from the rulings, but to be fair, it was never explicitly said that you can't help each other, but again, it definitely felt a bit weird. Again, it ends up being another time that someone on the bottom from the previous week ends up winning the HOH, with him getting this really heroic edit here, getting this rocky music as he ends up winning, which is all very strange. And he does end up getting some pretty sympathetic content. His HOH room, talking about his family, where it did seem pretty clear the producers wanted you to like Bruno here. Also, here we end up getting a have-not competition where they have to get in teams of 3, which we do for some reason waste time on seeing the entire schoolyard pick here, but ends up being a ridiculous comp of them having to dress up as dogs, wearing shock collars, where the other 2 members of their team would have to guide them through a maze to bring back bones, to have food names on them, and all this was, again, just such a surreal challenge to be seeing here. It does lead to some fun moments from like Willow getting shocked constantly, and Godfrey being excited to get chicken feet, which again just feels very strange that was even a food in the mix here, though again I feel it was clearly put in there for Godfrey. Here we end up spending so much time on Sarah being upset at the fact that she knows she's going up, and upset none of her allies are helping her, where we do end up seeing the hexagon get established on the show here, which was actually formed the previous week, and it was an alliance that essentially mixes the Bermuda Triangle with the likes of Brittany, Sarah, and Johnny that instantly crumbles here, with Zach and Jordan deciding to instantly throw him under the bus to Bruno, with Bruno already being on board with putting up Johnny and Sarah, with Johnny as a target here, again due to his strength and challenges. But again, we do end up spending a lot of this week rolling around Sarah's perspective, seeing her having another meltdown right after the HOH comp, and really I do feel like Sarah comes off on a bit of a high horse throughout all this. While I obviously agree with her point that the point of an alliance is for them to protect you in the game, and they clearly weren't, and we see her feeling betrayed by that. The way that Sarah ends up talking about it here is as if she's like the only good player here, and saying that she's being punished for playing the game, and we see her getting frustrated at Brittany for acting cool. Or again, it feels like her complaining about how her alliance are bad players for not protecting her, when it's like clearly the opposite. Like maybe it's you that sucks as a player, and this further emphasizes that. Like we do end up getting this like weird scene of Sarah walking in on Ashley and Peely having girl talk, and she proceeds to then talk about how easy they have it, and it's a cop-out that she has to work every day, which I mean, yeah, but maybe because they're playing better than you are. Either way, we get Johnny and Sarah being nominated here, and while Johnny does end up remaining the target, we do end up seeing Bruno consider a Kevin backdoor, with some focus on Kevin lying to Bruno and thinking he's buying it, only for that to not be the case, where all this content ends up being kind of humorous considering how the relationship policy plays out in BB Can 5. But again, by this point, Kevin was actually decently positioned to the point where against Johnny or Sarah, I don't think it's a guarantee that Kevin goes home, where it likely would have been a close vote. And even then, it never felt like Bruno was actually going to do this unless it was a position where Johnny had won the veto in particular. But again, all that ends up being a moot point. And again, we end up getting to the veto pick. Kevin talking about how Johnny is a huge target, needs to distance himself from him. And what do you know? He gets picked. I never would have guessed that. And also, who would have guessed that the comp itself ends up having social strategy aspects to it? I would test Kevin's relationship with Johnny, where the challenge itself is one where they end up having to use a tennis ball gun to hit rackets with players' faces on them. And once a player's targets are all out, they're out of the game, aka a comp built for the majority that makes it just extremely unlikely that the nominee will end up winning, which again is kind of the point of these veto comps. Like I really don't get why they seem to make these sort of comps, where again I do think they obviously allow for the opportunity to cause some drama through who each player targets. The problem is that again it favors the majority, and again with competitions that you want to divvy out power, you want those challenges to not favor the majority, as then it just becomes extremely predictable. Now, there is technically a counter to that in the fact that players are able to lock down one of their targets before the other player ends up shooting, but that doesn't end up being significant enough of a defense here to where, again, any chance of the nominees winning here was pretty much gone from the very beginning, where we see them being targeted over and over and over again. And what do you know? Kevin decides to target Johnny. How shocking. Now, I will say, obviously, this is the correct call for Kevin's game, as and with the knowledge that he is the potential backdoor, Kevin should be doing everything he can to make sure that neither Johnny or Sarah end up winning this veto. But obviously this ends up getting hyped up as this like massive betrayal when really it was just like the obvious move. Oh, well, we see Bruno end up winning the veto itself because he's a world-class gamer, which helped him, I guess. But clearly Bruno isn't going to use the veto here. That is unto the reveal of this week's Twistos Twists. Now, technically it was revealed at the last eviction, but again, it ends up involving Canada's vote of them being able to choose between two different types of vetoes for the week. For some reason, being the start of this season's just unnecessary twist that they have almost every week, which is really what the season ends up being known for this ridiculous number of twists that end up messing with the overall gameplay of the season, with this probably being the least offensive of these twists, but also probably the most unnecessary in this, again, giving Canada the choice between a forced veto or a double veto, which I will say, I was actually kind of surprised the fact that a double veto ends up being picked here, as I actually do think the forced veto is actually more of a guarantee for drama, while the double veto, as we see here, can just be a dud and just not be used. Now, to be fair, if Johnny or Sarah had won it, obviously they would have used it and both of them would have been safe. But again, in this spot where Bruno has the power, he obviously isn't going to use it, as why would he do this? It's just sprung on him at the last second, where again, I don't get why they didn't just make this knowledge available to the players that there was a double veto in play, allowing for Bruno to plan with this in mind, prep his allies for the move he wants to make. But again, in the way that it's handled, it just gives no incentive for him to actually be using this. And finally, they end up using this as a cliffhanger, which is like, who cares? Like, obviously he's not going to use it. Now, with that said, he did actually consider making a pretty massive move here and taking a shot against Zach and Ashley, but ends up saying it's too early, which, considering he was their target the following round, it probably wasn't too early. But I will say, like, I do get why he was apprehensive to be making this move in this position. And again, obviously no time to really think about this beforehand and plot around this. No time to set up the votes where who knows what would happen even if he did do this. And really, again, it just makes all this just a complete flop of a twist. But either way, we then get to some tasks for the week, with Sarah getting a task sponsored by Remedy, a now canceled show on Global, which I believe got canceled the year that this actually came out, which pretty apt for BB Can. But this was a weird one of like Sarah having to act and pretend to pass out and in this like really over the top way, and then the others have to do a scavenger hunt to heal her, I guess. Again, this is so weird. Oh, well, we also get a BBTV segment where players were told to put on a show for the live feeders, where we do see them recreating moments from BB Can 2, with it culminating in a cameo from John in his baby costume, so thank God. But also we end up seeing them do a talent show, giving us Sarah roasting people, which I guess some people found funny, where really I found Zach's sarcastic comments after each act more funny than Sarah's. And probably the most important moment from all this actually comes from the after party, where we do end up seeing Sarah making out with Willow, with this being pretty important in many ways. I mean, first in the fact that obviously Sarah and Willow end up being closer and it being a pseudo showmance on the season. Willow ends up being a pretty integral number for Sarah in the following weeks, but also ends up being a big moment for Willow personally, where I know she creds this with the moment that she realized that she was a lesbian. So again, good for her. Also, here we do get some content that felt like weirdly connected to the events that happened the following week, with this feeling like something you would put together on like Survivor, where you know the results. Yeah, again, they just end up setting up this JP blindside pretty well during this week, where we see Godfrey and Sarah talking about making a secret alliance, which again, neither were particularly loyal to, but it does really show them having this working connection that plays a factor into Sarah's flip into following around, along with us also seeing Bruno becoming increasingly sus of Zach and JP, clearly calling out that they're working together, which again, most people seem to recognize at this point, despite their attempts to keep their alliance secret. But this leads to Bruno talking about needing to target Zach in a couple weeks, which again, in most cases, would have been too late. But this does show Bruno, again, actively working against Zach and JP at this point, being this looming danger for them. But really, we do get some intrigue coming into the vote here in a spot where there really shouldn't be, where obviously Johnny should go home for really most people on the board, and it did seem like nothing would change that fact. And to be fair, nothing could change that, but Sarah decides to tempt her own fate here. We're going to seeing her plotting for the future with Johnny, just assuming that Johnny's obviously going home. He's screwed anyway, and through that, he's going to help me set up my game after this. And she ends up leaking to him the fact that she wants to work with Bruno in the following round to take out Kevin and Zach, which is, again, a kind of insane thing to do. And again, Johnny obviously has these ties to Kevin and Zach, and what do you know? Johnny ends up leaking this back to them and ends up throwing her under the bus, where Johnny does put on a pretty valiant effort here. This plan didn't end up working on keeping him. It still at least warns Zach to the fact that Sarah is working against him. That is, if Zach and JP believed any of this, where, wow, this could have been this moment that really sinks Sarah's game if they had just realized what Johnny was saying was true. They instead take this as a last-ditch plea from him over genuine, credible information, where, again, I do just question, like, why did Sarah do this? This really just opens up the opportunity for the vote to flip on her, and getting Zach and JP to probably make what is the optimal move for them in particular, where I do think Johnny would have been more likely to work with them down the road than Sarah, but obviously the vote ends up landing on Johnny anyway, with him getting a unanimous vote against them. And with that, we lose Johnny. I think Johnny's a really fun player on this season. While I do think his edit is, again, a bit disappointing, that just very much plays into the stereotypes, I do think Johnny as a player is like a really interesting one in the sense that, again, he is a massive super fan of the show and seemed to have the right strategic idea on what to do in most given situations. The problem is that I do think he just very much struggled to have any social capital in the game. He made himself too big of a target at points, and he also maybe played a bit emotionally at points in positions where he knew that he shouldn't be doing these things. I think Johnny's a player that I think has potential. He is clearly a massive fan of the show, and I think he's someone that could have a lot of potential to return. The problem is that, obviously, at this point, not very likely. But with that, we then get to week 5, probably one of the best weeks in Big Brother Canada history. Again, a really insane week, massive blindside at the end. The problem is that, again, it feels like it's all happens because of the twist. And, well, again, that doesn't necessarily demerit the entire week. It is disappointing that a result this great couldn't have happened a bit more naturally. But by the way, we do get to the HOH comp, it being before or after, where we don't end up finishing the HOH in the eviction episode, which becomes the standard. But here it's because they need to set up the buyback, which we'll talk about. Anyway, we see Newport finally deciding to try in this HOH comp, feeling like now is the time to make a move against Bobby and Bruno, which, considering Bruno's plans of targeting them the following round, again, this probably ends up being the right call. But here we do have seen JP talking about how this is his comp to win because he's the brains of the operation, only for him to then get a question wrong and be eliminated, with Zach proceeding to call him the dead weight that he's carrying around, which felt very harsh. But ultimately, Zach ends up winning the challenge here, which was pretty clutch of him, as he was in a tiebreaker alongside Godfrey, who clearly would have targeted him. But otherwise, he probably would have actually been better off if he didn't win this HOH, considering what he ends up doing with it. Where we see this going downhill right from the beginning here, with JP having a pretty massive celebration after Zach wins, like jumping into his arms, which surely helps with keeping their alliance secret. And it's following this where we end up seeing Jordan saying that he knows he has to do damage control, and his way of doing that is to tell Zach to nominate him, with JP saying that this might be the stupidest move, but it's so crazy it might work. Which, no, it's just the stupidest move. Now, obviously, we do see the likes of like Dan nominating Memphis and BB10 to cover their alliance, and it feels like that's what JP was essentially wanting to replicate here. But again, one, I don't actually even think that was Dan's best move in that position. But also, this is an even worse situation where, again, everyone knows that you're together, and they just saw you celebrating together, to where, again, it just comes off so see-through what you're doing here, especially when, like, most people in the house have alliances that the two of you are involved in, so obviously they know that you're actually working together. This is also the point where we do finally get introduced on the show to the Diaper Alliance, which, what a name. But it's really an alliance that seemed to be poised to run the game at this point, essentially being an alliance of the two showmances coming together alongside JP right in the middle. Also, essentially, the Bermuda Triangle alongside their showmances, but still, again, an alliance of essentially all of the 21 to 22-year-olds outside of Godfrey that, again, was set up extremely well at this point, especially with Zach and Bauer this week, and felt like this alliance that really could run the table on competitions, which, I mean, they kind of do for the short term, even after the mistake they end up making across this week. But again, here we end up seeing Zach deciding to nominate JP alongside Godfrey, with the real plan here actually being to backdoor Bruno. And to do so, they end up enacting a pretty similar plan to what Brittany did for Greg in trying to convince Bruno and Bobby that the backdoor is actually Kevin, which we instantly see them see through in this position, especially with JP doing a pretty bad job acting through all this as well, and being pretty happy in him talking to Godfrey about going on the block together, which was very strange. But the first episode of this cycle doesn't actually end at the nomination ceremony, as we also end up getting the buyback in this episode, which, I mean, let's talk about it now. I really hate how they handle almost everything about the buyback on this season. I mean, first in the fact that it was done midweek, meaning that the inclusion of this new player does disrupt the plans that were already in motion, obviously being very unfair to that HOH in particular. But also, probably the worst of it all is the fact that the pre-jurors here end up also being sequestered together, where again, BBUS has done this in the past of having these pre-jury buybacks. And when they've done this before, these players were sequestered alone. And really, that's the way it should be done. As again, when it's handled in this way, it ends up allowing the returning player to come in with so much information, pretty much an overhead's view of everything that's going on in the game. Again, not necessarily just benefiting them, but also their allies when they come back to the game, as they obviously all openly talked about what alliances they were in, allowing for them to know who's playing the best game and be able to gather information to use against them, to where we do end up seeing on the show here the entire group just agreeing to target Zach and JP, realizing they've been playing all sides, which obviously pays dividends by the end of the week. But also we have all of them but Greg talking about wanting to work with Sarah if they get back into the game. And where I know Neha supposedly was like this main person really being that drum, which again obviously gives some credit to Sarah for having this close enough relationship with Neha to be fighting for her in the pre-jury house. But also, how often do we get a pre-jury house? Like, it's not like any of this was intentional, but this ends up being a massive boon for Sarah's game. The fact that someone comes back in the game and ends up becoming an undying loyal ally to them, and also having so much information on what actually is happening in the game, while also being someone that again helps her take out her current targets, with again this feeling of position where Sarah's just so greatly indirectly helped by a twist, which somehow ends up not being the last time this ends up happening. But anyway, we get the second chance competition, which ends up having them have to hold onto a rope for as long as possible. A perfect competition for Cindy of Finesse. Really felt like a pretty unfair competition here, especially for the bigger people here, where the men end up dropping right away. Then we see Risha go, and really sucks for Risha, someone who again obviously had to wait entire time. They're being screwed off the bat just to not have a chance in this competition. But it does come down to Cindy, Finesse, and Neha. And I remember really rooting for Neha at the time, though Cindy, Finesse, is the one to pull it out here. Though before formally joining the house, she's told to go to the vault, where because of KFC, she has a chance to earn a week of safety, which you would assume the task will be relatively easy, as obviously they would want Cindy Finesse to have this safety, and here we have her having to solve a logic puzzle, and who would have guessed that she gets it? Gets a safety necklace with an S. But not before a cliffhanger, as this doesn't get wrapped up until the following episode. But either way, Cindy Finesse ends up returning to the house, and finally we see JP being really excited here, which, again, that's a shame. But really most end up being really annoyed at her return, and we do end up seeing the house quickly make a pact here to take her out next anyway. But then at the same time, we end up seeing Zach being very frustrated, to where while JP ends up saying the plan stays the same, we see Zach saying here that he doesn't know, where after Cindy Finesse ends up coming back into the game here, we do end up seeing him being kind of out on backdooring Bruno, talking about how it's too early now, where this really leads to Zach wanting to play more conservative here, aka the negatives of having so many twists in the game. But I do think for Zach, again, this is really just the wrong move, as again, you've already put into motion this backdoor Bruno plan, where he was clearly meant to be the target. And he even knows that himself, to where, again, you going back on that plan here once you've already started, especially when your closest ally on the block, again, just feels like such an idiotic move. Now, again, it's a move that he makes after being prompted by this twist, to where, again, who knows what he would have done if the twist was not involved, but it's still a spot where I do think his overall decision-making here was just pretty idiotic. But either way, we end up seeing Cindy with an S pretending to not know anything about what happened, only for her to then pull Sarah aside and give her the full rundown. Obviously ends up turning Sarah against Zach even more, and talk about using this info against him, which again gives Sarah a lot of power in this game, which she got through having all of her allies get voted out. And this is all while we see JP really trying to reel Cindy Finesse in and have her join the Diaper Alliance, which again, would have been a good offer for Cindy Finesse, only for her to then not take it and just talk about how she's playing him, where, again, this was actually probably her best path forward. But anyway, we get to the Vito comp, a pretty cool looking comp here of it being this like giant vertical ant maze, and a really notable comp as well because we end up having JP look even worse here as he proceeds to just throw it for some reason. Now, obviously JP was never winning this comp anyway, but again, for him to just like fake sleep at the top of the maze and even wait before hitting the button at the end was all really dumb for someone who's on the block. But again, no one was beating Zach in this competition, with him now having all the power in his hands, and he surely won't blow that power. But we end up seeing Zach telling JP that he can't use the veto on him, and the plan is to stay the course, which obviously ends up upsetting JP here, feeling like he's just deserting him on the block, and we do end up seeing him get very emotional here, saying he thought they had something special. But this interestingly does lead to JP starting to set up a game without Zach here, exposing everything to Kevin, telling him about Newport and the chop shop, to where at this point it seemed like the fortress actually becomes JP's priority, where again, only that lasted. But also we end up seeing him reaching out to Sarah, being genuine in his attempts to work with her here, only for her to just not believe a single bit of it, and instead think that Jordan's trying to play her, and Zach actually put him up to this, which actually turns her against Jordan even more, which is bad considering he actually wanted to work with her. Anyway, we get to the veto ceremony, one of the most notable veto ceremonies in the history of the show, with JP giving his typical JP speech of mimicking Tom Plant's veto speech from his boot round, which again, I always found humorous myself, of him saying, "Why use the veto on me? Because why not, bro?" But again, this is where we do cut to the more notable speech here, coming from Godfrey. Starting Godfrey's perpetually for making these really notable speeches here, this possibly being one of my favorite BB Can moments, and us having Godfrey saying that if you have any sense in your head at all, I urge you to not use the veto on me. If I come off this block, it's you I'm coming after. I want your blood on these hands. Tell Zach to use the veto on his boy JP. Says that using your closest ally as a pawn to send me home, never a good idea. To which we end up seeing JP whispering to Zach that he thinks he should do it. And what do you know, Zach doesn't do it. But really, this is all just such a fantastic moment. Again, really feeling like this big breakout moment for Godfrey, who again had been very quiet in the edit up to this point. I mean, really popping on the show at this point and becoming a central character here, being portrayed in a very similar way to how like Dr. Will was portrayed in BB2, and actually playing a somewhat similar game to him as well. And really this speech in itself ends up being a really innovative move that I do think you see a lot more of in the modern day, actively calling out another player and trying to create this rivalry with them so that the others become less incentivized of taking you out, as they now want to keep you around to keep this rivalry in the game, having these two guarantees and these two people that are for sure going to be going after each other, and that means that they're not going after you. And again, I think Godfrey really utilizes this to the best of his ability. After following this, we do instantly see people talk about wanting Godfrey around to use him as a weapon against Zach. Following this, we end up getting a bevy of overconfident Zach content, with him saying that he can't see anyone voting out JP and that Godfrey isn't going to be able to swing a vote, and tells JP that that's funny that people should be sending you home, but we've brainwashed people into thinking that you bring value to the game. Saying that they could vote out his best ally over somebody that wants his head. Which, I mean, yeah, maybe they know that too. As again, this cuts to Cindy Finesse saying that she sees Godfrey in a different light now, and after his speech, to where they end up talking game now, to which Cindy Finesse decides to lead the charge to save Godfrey. Again, saving him over Jordan, her showmans, which is insane. And I will give Cindy Finesse credit for the execution of this move, as it's very impressive for her to organize all these votes together to snipe Jordan out of the game, someone who is probably in the best position in the game over the last few weeks. Now, at the same time, this is a terrible move for her. Again, getting rid of one of the only people that genuinely wanted to work with her long term, and a person that actually had influence in the game to keep her around. And by taking him out, she's essentially getting rid of one of her only lifelines in the game. And again, she's doing this simply because she was told to in Sequester. And this is literally the game plan they had told her to do coming into the house. And we do end up seeing her instantly getting Sarah and Brittany on board with this plan, which I'll say I also question this move from Sarah's point of view, where again, Jordan genuinely wanted to work with her and was someone that had more influence in the game than someone like Godfrey that could have actually flipped the power structure in a way that actually benefited Sarah, while Godfrey's just going to be kind of dangling on the bottom of the game and playing multiple sides. Where again, I think Jordan actually would have been a better ally for Sarah. Or again, she really does this because she just is unaware of the fact that he's willing to flip on Zach and doesn't believe it. So I think this is also probably the wrong call for Sarah, though to be fair, not as disastrous as it was for Cindy Finesse. But again, we end up seeing Cindy Finesse pulling in Bruno, who also is instantly on board here. Probably the person who actually benefits the most from making this move, as JP was pretty out on working with Bruno for down the road, and Godfrey also was an extremely close ally of his. So again, this is kind of a no-brainer for Bruno, though the entire vote ends up coming down to Bobby, where I remember in real time watching this on the feeds and being so frustrated watching Bobby in the lead up to this vote, and the fact that he seemed pretty dead set against it. Again, being pretty aloof to the fact that Zach was actively working against him and still wanting to keep the chop shops together, despite no one thinking it's a real alliance at this point except for him. Where again, Bobby doesn't end up making this decision to flip until really the last second, where Brittany ends up exposing the fact to him that Zach was willing to backdoor him this week. But again, it's a move that also for Bobby should have been a no-brainer. Again, this is such a good move for Bobby. Again, better than actually most of the other people that are making this move. But again, it took him a while to get him on board at this point, in a spot where I do question why they didn't just attempt to go for Willow and pull her over, where I know Willow in herself was also very close to Zach. And to be fair, Cindy Finesse does end up having this big ploy she wants to utilize Willow for, and trying to use Willow as a scapegoat, using that to feign that she was in on the plan, as why would she turn against Jordan, which was such a misguided plan, as again, obviously they're going to piece this together, especially when there's 5 other people that know about this plan, that you were the one leading it, which again makes all that so much worse. But again, like, Willow's someone that, again, had a very close relationship with Sarah. Do you think also would have seen the benefits of taking out JP? I think she's someone that could have been pulled over in this vote, but they don't really end up ever attempting to do so. But again, this ends up being a really exciting moment for the season, one of the best individual vote-offs in the history of the show. Obviously one perpetuated by a twist, both in the fact that obviously noms likely change had Cindy Finesse not come back into the game, but also the fact that with these noms, Godfrey would not have had the votes to stay without Cindy Finesse there. But also, Cindy Finesse is the one leading the charge on this vote and actually gathered most of these votes together to where again, it really feels like none of this really happens had it not been for the fact that Cindy comes back into the game, which does make me feel bad for JP, who is extremely twist-screwed in a spot to where, despite, again, making some bad play along the way, he is someone that, again, likely stays in most given situations. All for Godfrey, someone that I do still largely credit his game beyond this moment. I do feel like this is a spot where he does get pretty fortunate with how all these things play out, though at the same time, I think you could definitely argue the fact that he was really put in this position because of Cindy coming back, but also even in that world, it's not like locked in. I do feel like Zach was showing some signs of being hesitant about the move either way. But before we get to the eviction, we do end up getting a showman segment of Kevin and Peely kissing in the rain, which gets propped up as this really romantic moment, so good for them. All while we also get a task, because obviously we needed a task, where we see the players being told to pick 2 players to spend 24 hours in the vaults, with them ending up choosing Bobby and Cindy Finesse, and they literally just have to stay there for 24 hours. That was boring, but at the end they get this big choice, the reveal that they're offered $10,000, the prize money to leave the game, which again, how cheap of them to take it away from the already small prize pool. But again, neither of them ended up hitting the button here, where, again, really for Cindy with an S, probably should have here, as again, she was pretty screwed no matter what. But again, that doesn't lead to anything. But again, we eventually get to the eviction, where we get the reveal that the evicted player will become the first member of the jury for some reason, because we needed more twists on this season. Obviously, this being extremely early. Again, being a jury at the final 12 on a 16-person season, which is just ridiculous. And obviously, again, there's a reason for it. But again, did we need that? But again, this ends up being a really iconic eviction here, one of the best of all time, giving us some really great speeches off the bat. Again, Godfrey still going for Zach, talking about making a big move and finally doing work, saying that if you keep him, he's coming after Zach and he'll be sending his ass packing, with the crowd really roaring in this moment, where again, they're clearly on Godfrey's side throughout all this, where again, this is a point where BB Can didn't really try to contain their audiences, and through that, again, it did lead to points where it definitely could have affected how people played the game, again, knowing what Canada wanted and trying to play into that. But this is all while JP ends up coming off as more of an idiot here, telling the players to vote him out and keep Godfrey, saying who will take a nap every day and who will start every sentence with yo, and says, oh wait, I could do those things. And again, all that was just so cringy. And we do get to the eviction vote, which is back and forth here, where obviously ends up being a 4-4 coming into Bobby's vote, where he ends up voting his fellow Virgin Excursion member JP, which I love how like this is such an iconic moment for the show, but also one just not explained on the show at any point. In the fact that the Virgin Excursion was this like fake alliance that formed containing the virgins in the house of JP, Ashley, and Bobby, who was faking being a virgin because he had to play into that innocent persona, which again, all very weird. But again, we end up having the crowd really erupting in this moment, where I did find it very awkward just how Bobby, when hearing this, clearly thinks that they're cheering for him, where I remember him thinking of himself as like a fan favorite following this, and no, they just want JP out. And again, we get an all-time great reaction to the vote here, where we have this amazing still image of just seeing everyone's various reactions to this vote reveal, which is just fun to see that, along with the fact that Godfrey just jumps in the air as he hears the vote result, which is obviously very iconic. Though I'll say I actually don't love how this was put together for the show, where we do end up seeing Arissa doing her typical thing of, again, saying the vote count first, then giving a long pause before eventually saying, "Godfrey, you are safe," which I thought was pretty dumb, as again, once you tell them it's a 5-4, they obviously know the vote flips, so why are we pretending like it's still Godfrey getting voted out? But also, like, the edit of all this is very choppy, where they clearly edited out most of Jordan's exit here, where after Godfrey's jump, we just cut to Jordan going up the stairs. Well, it felt like we clearly missed out on something along the way. But again, all this is still a very iconic eviction. The first moment I think of when I think of this season, and really one of these moments that really just highlights how good Big Brother can be. But with that, again, we end up losing JP, and I remember at the time just really feeling bad for Guy. Obviously, he's a massive super fan of the show, big RHEP fan, and that I personally resonated with a lot at the time, and to see him just getting sniped out, again, making one of the dumbest plays in Big Brother history, going out on one of the most iconic evictions. Again, I did feel for him, but obviously, again, he ended up hosting podcasts on RGP following this, and retiring, but it seems like he's having a perfectly normal life now. So again, it worked out. But again, I thought JP was fun in the show. Now, again, you could definitely argue that, again, he's trying too hard to be like the likes of a Will and a Dan, and through that can be just kind of annoyed of how much of a shtick he's putting on. But I personally did find him to be a very fun presence on the show, and when I felt like I actually played a pretty good game until everything just kind of crumbled around him. We then move on to week 6. Probably one of the weaker weeks of the season. But we start off with another quiz HOH comp, with them being shown videos and them having to name which competition it was, where if you're correct, you can eliminate whoever you like, which again, I like this whole strategy aspects of the challenge. At the same time, though, again, just favors the majority. But we do end up seeing Bobby guessing right away before getting even to see competition, and clearly trying to throw it, thinking that he's in such a good position at this point, which he isn't. And what do you know? He accidentally gets it right somehow. Where again, why even say an answer here? Again, you're better off just not saying anything. But again, we get such a funny reaction here from being so frazzled, the fact that he got it right. And here he ends up eliminating Cindy with an S, telling her that you only get one life in Big Brother, instantly putting an end to this group that had just come together to flip the vote the previous round. With again, all this happening actually before the end of the eviction episode, which was so disheartening to see, as again, it would have been nice to see this group at least stick together for another round, at least weaken the numbers of the Diaper Alliance, which still comprised of, again, two pretty powerful duos in the game that were pretty good at competitions, though to be fair, the HOH results would have led to this group fracturing either way. But here again, we end up seeing Bobby do literally the exact same thing for the following question and gets himself eliminated there. And beyond that, I did find this to actually be kind of a weird competition in the sense that I did not love the fact that they didn't have to answer the formal names of the challenges. The fact that we see Peely end up getting one right because she answers the tennis one. Sorry, I think it just kind of leaves it a bit wonky on the rulings here, to where again, I think just having them say the official names would have been the better way to go. But either way, Peely does end up going on to win this HOH, aka giving the Diaper Alliance all the power this week. Which, to be fair, I guess is another power shift. But along with that, we also get a have-not comp, which was actually kind of a funny one. The fact that we have them having to play soccer and bubble suits, and also having a halftime show of Bruno dressed in a bear suit and Cindy being a cheerleader, which is like, what are we doing? But again, the actual fun aspect of the challenge was the fact that we end up seeing Kevin and Willow be captains, and Kevin decide to throw the competition and picking people that he wants to be on slop with, picking Godfrey, Brittany, and Sarah as their emotional players. Only to then see Godfrey himself also try to throw the competition with him actually wanting to build a bond with Kevin, which I thought was actually a pretty interesting play there. But again, this obviously leads to Sarah getting her typical thing of, oh my God, of calling out Kevin for throwing the competition because she picks up on all this stuff. But we do get a lot of initial focus here on Cindy Finesse, trying to pretend like she wasn't in on the flip, crying about Jordan leaving and throwing Willow under a bus. Even though we have Sarah literally telling her here that she shouldn't be lying, as again, she will be ratted out. And while we do end up seeing the diapers, I actually believe Cindy Finesse initially here and thinking it was Will that actually did flip on them. We obviously end up seeing Bobby leaking to Zach that Cindy Finesse was the one leading it. Zach saying that Godfrey didn't do a thing. It was Cindy Finesse who was the mastermind. Which again shows the lack of respect people have for Godfrey, but also just further emphasizes the target on Cindy with an S. He's back here. And I'll say at least credit to Cindy with this for the fact that at least she does pick up on the fact that she is in a lot of danger here, where you see her trying to expose the information that she got from Sequester to try to turn Kevin and Peely against the former Chop Shop, particularly Bobby and Bruno, though again, it really ends up going nowhere. But again, I at least give Cindy Finesse a lot of credit for at least never giving up, where we end up seeing her attempting so many different plots across this week in a desperate attempt to save herself. But again, none of them end up actually mattering. But anyway, we end up seeing Kevin getting most of the content this week for the HOH, with him essentially just controlling Peely's decisions, getting her to go after Cindy Finesse and nominate Godfrey as a pawn. I'll say, I really don't get why Kevin is doing this over targeting Bobby, who is more openly against him, and also someone that is very good at competitions. While Cindy Finesse has shown some interest in working with him, and while I know that the entire house had this pact to take out Cindy Finesse at the first opportunity, I don't think it was the right call for Kevin and Peely to go along with that in this spot. But anyway, we get to the veto comp, which is KFC sponsored, with it essentially just being concentration and trying to find pairs from their box, with all the items being related to the $5 fill-up. So that's something. But also, we end up seeing some hidden advantages or disadvantages, including one that has them having to start over, but now of only needing 3 matches, with Godfrey getting that right away, which ends up actually being a massive advantage for him. Though we end up seeing Cindy Finesse getting the same. It's all going well for her until she gets the disadvantage of her just being eliminated from the comp entirely, which is kind of insane. That in a comp that was so life or death for her in the game, she just ends up being sniped out of it here. I'll always see Godfrey having a pretty easy win with him saying that he knows people are going to be kissing his ass and telling him what to do with the veto, which it's like, what do you mean? Like, obviously know that you're going to use the veto on himself. I guess outside Cindy Finesse, who actually does have the gall to beg Godfrey to use the veto on her, which again, at least she doesn't give up. Also, here we have seen Willow get a punishment of having to wear a hot dog costume. So that happened. Cindy Finesse ends up leading a campaign here against Bobby, where we do end up seeing them get into a bit of a tiff over Cindy Finesse making Peely cry when telling her that she's disappointed in her, and we see Bobby defending Peely for whatever reason. And this is where we do end up hearing Cindy Finesse's pitch on why Bobby should be nominated, which revolves around Bobby's secret veto, which was never mentioned until now. But on the show, we end up getting this big flashback to Bobby pretending to have found a secret power of veto and using that to convince people to not nominate him, with this, again, just being such a stupid plan and this actually just further incentivizes people to nominate him, as again, they obviously don't want you to have the secret power of veto, and they obviously just want to flush that away. But also, him having this veto makes no sense. Again, BB Can is notoriously known for forcing players to keep things secret, to where there's no way that they would allow Bobby to just openly use his veto as a scare tactic if it were real, to where this obviously just felt like another misguided play from Bobby, especially considering he also later ends up telling Willow that it's fake anyway, where again, what was the point of any of this? But despite that, Cindy Finesse's campaign here ends up being pretty ineffective, though again, I really don't understand why, as again, why allow Bobby to have this theoretical power for the following round? Or it's not even like Bobby's like pretending this is like a diamond power veto where he gets to decide the replacement nom. Again, he's literally just saying he has another veto. So again, I do think there's really no world where Bobby isn't the better target for Kevin and Peely in this position, but again, they don't go with it. But again, we get to the veto ceremony, with Godfrey getting another notable speech here, obviously using the veto on himself and saying that he's going to be fighting the good fight and that he needs to stay to get rid of the showmances and that this isn't a lover's paradise, which really did feel like just a lesser version of the blood in your hand speech. But again, Ray brings up the concept of Godfrey being against showmances, again, finally ends up becoming his detriment by the end. But either way, Brittany is the renom because they still want Cindy Finesse out for some reason. And obviously, Brittany is this perpetual pawn. It is funny that we end up seeing Cindy Finesse use this Godfrey strat immediately following this, trying to paint herself against Bobby, making it public that she's going for Bobby, where, again, funny to see that strategy already being utilized right away. So, again, it doesn't really do much for her. And we see Cindy Finesse being on a bit of a high horse here, saying that she's being punished for playing the game. It's like, again, no, you're just being punished for playing the game poorly. This is also where we get the recurrence of Sarah's same style of content, again, now later into the game, of her now considering taking out Brittany over Cindy Finesse, because she's been the one carrying the load for Brittany, and Brittany's an emotional player, which, again, if Brittany's an emotional player, then so are you. Obviously, all this is just this red herring that Cindy Finesse might actually stay. Though, again, in a spot where even if Sarah wanted to do this, she wouldn't have had the influence to actually do anything about it anyway. But it does lead to us seeing more of the Sarah-Willow relationship, with Willow seemingly being Sarah's true allegiance at this point, though strangely, Brittany ends up seemingly picking up on that, with Willow also becoming wary of Brittany, with the two essentially going after each other at this point in an attempt to win Sarah's loyalty. And through that, we do end up seeing Willow telling Sarah about her worries about that Brittany wants her out and actually wants to save Cindy Finesse this week, though obviously that doesn't go anywhere either. Now, beyond that, we get a couple tasks along the way, one of multiple people being given the same mission of having to sneak into the vault at the same time, all while Bruno is tasked with making sure that no one actually succeeds, which, again, was really fun to see the likes of Kevin, Sarah, and Godfrey all thinking that they were tricking the others, only to be thwarted every turn. But also we get a really weird task of them having to go on a fake road trip where over 24 hours they have to take shifts walking on a treadmill with videos of locations playing in front of them, which is all very weird and pointless and doesn't even make for good TV. But it does lead to Zach and Cindy Finesse having to sleep outside, and she gets to campaign to him, and again, that will surely matter. All while we see Ashley and Willow crashing into Marcia the Moose, which was ridiculous. But either way, we get to the eviction where Cindy Finesse says that they should start playing without a stick up their bum. And then we get a unanimous Cindy Finesse vote. They're storming out of the house. And again, no real suspense in this vote off. But with that, we lose Cindy Finesse. And again, I thought Cindy Finesse was really fun TV on this season. Obviously, incredible character. Got an insane amount of confessionals. I believe one of the highest average confessional counts in all of BB Can, where she was just all over the show when she was there. To where while she was really only on the show for 3.5 weeks, she ends up being such a notable presence here to where they bring her back for BB Can 5, to where, again, Cindy Finesse obviously ends up just being a very fun character, but also a player that plays very hard. And I think that's something to very much commend her for, to where, while, again, I think Cindy Finesse is a terrible player, and I think she pretty much played the worst possible game she could have played on this season, I do feel like she's also one that I at least respect the gusto, even though it's mostly ineffective most of the time, and even when she is effective, she's doing something that's so bad for her game. But not for week 7, which ends up being one of the slower weeks of the season until obviously the big moment at the end. But we do start off with Q&A HOH about guessing how Cindy and Finesse responded, certain questions, with them weirdly having the answer between 1 through 100, where you get Sarah being excited as she knows Cindy Finesse the best. And who would have guessed it? She sucks at this comp. Going out on a question of Cindy being asked the likelihood of Kevin and Peely lasting, and her answering very low, which, I mean, to be fair, she was ultimately right, but again, wrong in this spot, to where we do end up seeing her have her typical meltdown following this, being frustrated at how others are playing the game. Now, I did also find it unfair that one of these questions was asking the likelihood of Zach being nominated this week, which, again, felt very leading, but ultimately Kevin talks about how he wants to win comps now, and what do you know? He wins the HOH. It's almost as if Kevin wins almost every comp that he tries in. But here he says that's time for a big move, I guess, where a lot of this week ends up being focused around Kevin, talking about needing to make this big move of taking out Bobby, a near consensus target that no one but Bruno was opposed to taking out here, which, again, just made a lot of this talk feel very contrived and did feel like them trying to shove Kevin down our throats about how great of a player he is when, again, this is just a very basic play. So again, he obviously ends up getting this really big mastermind edit, literally just doing the same thing that Brittany and Zach had done in previous weeks, with him going on to lie to his diaper alliance, Peely included, about Bobby being his target, and instead convince the entire house that his plan is to backdoor Godfrey, which why do you need to backdoor Godfrey? We do end up seeing Zach here pushing for Godfrey, which is pretty funny considering last week Zach had been pretty gung-ho about wanting Bobby out. Or again, if Kevin just explained this to Zach, I think it would have been fine. But either way, most end up being convinced of the Godfrey plan, at least initially. So Kevin says, why get rid of Godfrey when he can help get rid of Zach down the road? With Kevin clearly planning on cutting Zach in the near future, which he never obviously gets the chance to do. But clearly, again, this is a move about him setting up his pieces to take these pretty big shots in the next few rounds. But again, instead of backdooring Bobby in this spot, he does actually plan on just nominating him outright, though he ends up trying to get Bobby to volunteer for that, which he does, which the edit really portrays this as this really dumb move. And again, I've obviously criticized Bobby's game up to this point, but I really actually don't think this is that bad of a call for him, as I do think in this spot where, again, you're likely going to be on the block either way, again, you might as well be in a spot where you can play in the veto. Now, I know another part of his rationale was the fact that he wanted to hide his secret veto story. So it'd be weird if he was opposed to going on the block with the secret veto in his pocket, which, again, this is on you. But again, I actually do think in the spot that he actually is in, it's actually not the worst thing in the world to be nominated before the veto, as again, at least gives him a shot in that spot. But here we do end up seeing Kevin land on Brittany as the other nominee, because obviously, and what do you know? She gets content about how upset she is to be the pawn again and wants to be looked at as a strong player. And we do have Kevin saying in his nomination speech that the pawn is the most overlooked piece and could be the strongest at any point, despite literally calling her the weakest player in the game in confessional right before it. But again, if this was a scripted show, again, all this could have very much felt like foreshadowing, but obviously it's more so intended to be this more underdog content to try to make Brittany more likable here, even though that's countered by content about Sarah being annoyed at Brittany complaining. So again, that's something. Anyway, here we see Kevin attempting to make a deal with Godfrey, coming off as his savior and trying to set him up to go after Zach for down the road. Again, showing Godfrey's strat working in great effect here, and him, again, being kept around here as this weapon to take Zach out of the game in a spot where he's very openly just throwing competitions, so he doesn't actually have to take the shot himself, and again, will still have safety because of that. And while Godfrey doesn't really end up believing Kevin in this spot and continues to be wary of him, I do think this was the right call for Kevin in trying to forge this bond here, as again, if Godfrey was given the opportunity to take this shot, I do think he's more likely to target Zach and Ashley over Kevin and Peely, but again, none of that's mattering anyway. But following this, we do get an interesting task here where Kevin comes out in a genie costume and proceeds to put on this really ridiculous performance, but again, the task ends up having them being doled out punishments and rewards that the players themselves end up voting for which of each player gets that reward based on a riddle, which again, I thought was an interesting segment here, though. And once again, these punishments don't really lead to much, where again, we do see Sarah being to pick the have-nots, we see Brittany getting $42, we get sympathetic content from Bruno, who ends up not getting letters from home. We also see Godfrey initially getting a lobster costume, only for Peely to get a choice to pick any prize, and for some reason takes Godfrey's costume, which I legitimately don't know why. Like, I mean, I get not wanting to piss people off, but again, she could have just taken the $42. At least that's something. And again, it's not like Brittany would have been that upset. But, or you could just take in Bruno's prize of seeing clips from the season, which doesn't matter either. But again, the most interesting reward here actually ends up being one from Willow, where she ends up getting to write a letter to the jury, which I actually think is a really inspired mechanic here. I wouldn't be opposed to just everyone being able to do this on Big Brother, especially considering the shorter jury questioning at the end. Do you think having the players be able to send something to the jury before the tail end of the game, I think is something that would be interesting, but obviously it's not really how it's utilized here. And again, we haven't seen Sarah being excited that Willow won this, as Shirley, as again, this is another time that Sarah's ally wins something that could indirectly benefit her game. And while this one ends up, again, obviously being very marginal, I do think this actually does help Sarah in having Willow write to the jury about how undyingly loyal she is to Sarah, which again helps with the jury perception of Sarah's game, though at the same time, I think the people in the jury probably were likely to vote for Sarah at this point anyway. But also through this week, we do end up seeing content about how beneficial Willow is to Sarah's game, and seeing her infiltrate the Diapers Alliance game talks and being able to leak that information back out to Sarah, where again, this was a good position for Sarah that she doesn't end up using effectively. Now, beyond that, we also get another punishment segment revolving around Kevin and Zach, who get punished for not waking up to the waking call, being told to clean the house from top to bottom while wearing French maid outfits. and them having to do a weird accent. And it's like, what are we doing? This was so weird. But anyway, we get to the veto, which is a timed veto comp sponsored by The Brick, where the winners get $10,000 to The Brick. I definitely care. But here they have the recreated display of brick items. They'll only get to see display through a swing, where, again, we do see a lot of people struggling here with the swinging portion. And in general, it does seem like most people end up just kind of sucking at this challenge, including Sarah, with her saying that she has a good memory, just to be hung up on one item and messing it all up. Who would have guessed? Along with us also seeing Peely ending up just quitting the challenge by the end. But again, who would have guessed it? Kevin wins another physical/mental challenge, meaning that we're headed for a pretty boring Bobby boot, where even if Kevin was planning on taking Godfrey out here, he has no real incentive to actually be taking Bobby down in this spot, where obviously he thinks that he has a secret veto. So again, he would want to flush this, which again just shows how dumb that plan is to begin with. But anyway, we get to the veto ceremony where Kevin doesn't use the veto, to which Bobby then gets up and throws the secret veto away. It turns out to be just a broken clothing hanger, so that's something. But again, we have Kevin saying his master plan fell into place, I guess. Again, what a master plan. But again, Bobby ends up having no real chance to save himself here. Though we do get some content here from him overhearing the girls talking, where during the back portions of this week, we do end up seeing some movement here about potential girls alliance that was probably not going to end up being real, especially from the Ashley Peely side of things, with it feeling like them trying to secure their safety. Though it did seem like Sarah in particular was trying to take this seriously, which again might factor into the decision she makes down the road. And really, in general, the paranoia around this women's alliance plays such major dividends in the near future. But again, Bobby ends up using this as part of his campaign to Zach and Kevin to keep the men around. But again, that was never really going to work. And again, we get to the eviction where it's a unanimous Bobby vote, where even Bruno ends up voting for him. What ends up being a really rushed eviction. Also, despite how rushed this ends up being, we do still have to, for some reason, get a jury segment here, which has Jordan finally learning about Cindy being one to take him out, which leads to him just pushing her away and saying, "Don't touch me," which is really funny considering they end up hooking up in the jury house. But again, all this was like, why was this in this episode that had so much of the show? But either way, again, we lose Bobby in this spot, and I actually thought Bobby was a much better TV character on the rewatch here than I remembered. I remember Bobby being kind of a dud that didn't know anything about the game, and to be fair, that part of it's still true. But still, I do think, looking back on it, again, he's someone that at least tried some crazy things. Again, his secret veto, him pretending like he was this like really emotional guy and then going on his own to like celebrate how everyone's believing. And again, like there were some fun aspects to Bobby as a character, but again, Bobby as a player, that was pretty bad. I actually think probably even worse than I remembered, where again, I very rarely agree with a single thing Bobby does throughout this entire season. And I do think he ends up being pretty good casting in a spot where, again, I think he does get remembered as being a bit of a dud, though again, I think he has a lot more personality than what you would expect. But again, that's not the end of the week just yet, because we also here have the triple eviction. The first appearance of the triple eviction in BB Can, which obviously becomes a staple, and a pretty bad one at that. And obviously not necessarily bad TV, especially the one that we have here, where I've said in the past that this is probably one of my personal favorite like double/triples in BB Can history, where I know obviously a lot of people mention the Netta double in BB Can 5, though this one for me personally does surpass that. But again, I don't love the way that triples end up working here from multiple factors. I mean, first in the fact that it is, again, all contained within one round, where we do see them crown a single HOH, and in this spot also just not tell them that it's a triple until after HOH, which again, like why? Which again is pretty bad, especially considering just the little amount of information that they're given to think about what to do here, which is pretty ridiculous how at points they're made to make decisions on the spot in a position where BB Can pre-tapes their evictions. Where again, it is funny the fact that BBUS is able to find time for players to actually talk and have conversations during their doubles, yet BB Can doesn't at points, where I don't get why they can't just allow people to talk more and then just show it in the following episode, where you end up spending most of the next episode recapping the events of the triple anyway. So again, I really don't get why they don't get more time here, though again, I assume the reason they do this, particularly after the veto comp coming into the veto ceremony, is because they don't want to split up those into two separate segments. Though again, you could like edit it. That's an option. So obviously they want to keep the illusion that this is live for whatever reason. But again, BBUS does this. They have commercial breaks after each of these segments, which again is ridiculous. The fact that we literally come back for like a minute just to go back to commercial. Again, I do think it's a more fair way of handling this for the players. And again, it allows the players to talk through their decisions, where otherwise they're more incentivized to play conservatively, even though, again, that's not necessarily how it works in this spot. But again, at the end of the day, again, that was more of a tangent. The real issues with the triple, again, the main one is, again, how it functions, where again, because it's done in one round and we have this single HOH that determines both of the eliminations, it does give that HOH a lot of power. essentially the power of 2 HOHs and them getting to nominate 3 people, 2 of which end up going home, being a massive advantage for that specific HOH in a spot where it just feels like, again, they're just kind of handed this, or just because they won this one specific competition that allows them to do this that isn't even that different from any other HOH competition, which again feels very luck dependent. I never love like the voting mechanics of how people end up going home here, where and instead of having like 2 separate eviction votes to determine who goes home, we just have one single one to save a player. Again, over it being like an actual eviction vote, which, and to be fair, rarely makes any difference, especially without time to talk between the 2 votes. And just again, the concept of voting to save instead of evict is also weird to me. In general, I never really loved how this triple ends up being formatted, even though it does obviously lead to this big explosive moment for the show. But again, it's just a twist I never particularly loved. Where I personally prefer how BBUS handles triple evictions, and again, it's literally just 2 doubles back to back, which is a much more fair way of handling it. And while that obviously necessitates a longer episode, and also, even in itself, the concept of that is very flawed, as it's really condensing these 2 rounds that can be very integral rounds to the game and having interesting setup for the end game. And now, because of the triple, players probably play conservatively. Again, there are issues with that, but I do think it at least allows for like 2 people to get HOH in that time and determine who goes home, where again, it makes the HOH power not as powerful in that position as it is obviously in the BB Can triple. But also, I really don't like the precedent that this triple ends up having on how people play down the road, where we do end up seeing in following seasons that people just assume that a triple must be coming, and through that end up playing constantly for it, leading to more stagnant gameplay as people don't want to make this big move right before the triple and upset these comp threats, or it would be more likely that you go home if you hit the block. Where again, I remember on BB Can 6, that was a constant talk on that season, was people playing around plotting to try to survive the triple. That feeling like a major motivation behind a lot of moves on that season, which again, I don't love either. But anyway, we get to the actual HOH here, a Q&A comp about days, where Brittany ends up being the only one to get every question right, winning the HOH here. Also being a very clutch win for Brittany, being a shift in power after getting a long streak of Diaper Alliance HOHs. That again, I'm sure Brittany won't blow here, but also with that, again, this should have been extremely beneficial to Sarah's game. Again, another time of ally of Sarah's being involved in a twist that should greatly benefit her. And really, the only reason why it doesn't end up benefiting her that much is really rely on her. But again, Brittany is rushed inside, where she's told that it's not a double, it's a triple, where we get the shocked reactions here, and clearly a lot of fear from the Diapers, who surely are screwed here. And that, again, there are 3 nominees and a renom, where with this being an alliance of 4, it should be foolproof that 2 Diaper members should be going home, and surely. And unshockingly, we see her nominate Zach and Kevin as her 2 targets, the 2 biggest threats on the Diaper side, and the 2 that she doesn't have an alliance with, but also ends up nominating Peely alongside them. Again, a clear pawn at this point, as again, you'd think that they would have nominated Ashley if they were actually trying to do something with the intention of taking them out. Now, with that said, I think you probably should have put up Ashley in this spot either way, as again, she is more likely to win the veto in a spot where the only thing that can theoretically go wrong for Brittany is a Diaper member as not nominated winning the veto, and that would force a non-Diaper member to go on the block, though at the same time, again, you still have 2 Diaper members on the block, so it doesn't really matter. But anyway, we get to the veto, where we get the reveal that the HOH ends up not playing. So again, at least that's some level of balance there, where again, this is an extremely OP HOH to begin with, though obviously this ends up being the norm by the time of BB Can 7 for the HOH not playing the veto, which again, maybe I'll talk about the ramifications of that in my BB Can 7 retrospective. But again, the comp itself ends up being the typical like back and forth sort of veto that we typically have during doubles, and like normal, we also get terrible camera work here, with the focus really going all in on Kevin and Zach, obviously has the 2 targets, only for Bruno to pull out the win out of nowhere, which again seems like game over for Zach and Kevin, as there's no way Bruno is going to use the veto on them, especially with no time to think through this decision. And again, obviously again, he's had friction with them for the last few weeks, blindside JP, but again, we get to the point where he has to make his decision, you see him struggling, clearly knowing what he wants to do, but just not being sure of the ramifications of it, or again, this probably would have been an easier choice for him if he had time to think about it. But we do get this really great moment from my point of view, again, him just walking towards Zach and putting necklace around his neck without even saying a word, which again is such an insane moment, where I remember watching this live and this being one of the most shocking live moments I've seen on the show, where this really comes out of left field, and it's part of what really makes this triple stand out to me, is how many of these like really shocking moments we end up having, with again this really just being the first of which. But this is also probably the spot that I'm probably the most impressed with Bruno's game this entire season, where again, this is a pretty insane move to be pulling off. one that I do think is fully the right call at this point, where Bruno is in need of numbers at this point if he wants to get to the end, where if both Kevin and Zach end up going in this triple, Bruno's very likely the next target on the board, especially with this, again, impending girls alliance coming. So again, through this, he's keeping around Zach as a theoretical shield for him. Also keeps a number to target the women who, again, were assumed to be coming together at this point. And also, again, buy some loyalty with Zach in a spot where Zach was still more loyal to the diapers than to him, though this did allow Bruno to really become Zach's like fourth, I guess, which again isn't the worst spot in the world, especially where theoretically Bruno should still have these connections to Brittany and Sarah that he had been maintaining, who also should have no other options right now, and also Godfrey as an ally, to where, again, I think the play here to save Zach was actually a pretty brilliant move, especially one to be making on such short notice here. The problem is that he doesn't really follow up on it correctly, which ends up really butchering his relationships with Brittany and Sarah. And again, this was a pretty innovative move that, again, should have set Bruno up to be in this middle position through this endgame stretch with no one targeting him, at least in the short term. But obviously things don't end up really going his way. But and obviously with the veto being used here, Brittany now has an easy decision to make, as obviously you just nominate the other Diaper Alliance member to secure that you've dismantled that side of the house. And we clearly see Ashley here freaking out here, knowing that she's about to be the renom and that she'll likely go home against Peely, only for Brittany to nominate Willow. Again, another insane moment for this triple here. Again, really adding to these like twists and turns that happen in this one eviction, though also again just such a fumble from Brittany from my point of view, where again we had obviously got a lot of setup between the fracture between the two, Brittany and Willow both being wary of each other, but again for Brittany to actually take the shot here was again just straight up not the right call, when again the Diaper Alliance is still together and still so strong. I mean still almost being half the house following this round, and also still having that Zach and Ashley showmance together now coming for her in the game. Now obviously something to factor in here is the fact that was this girls alliance forming, and because that Brittany felt better about Ashley at this point than Willow, who was openly considering targeting her, to where again I can at least get it from that point of view. And taking out Willow does pull Sarah closer to her, though even then like Brittany does describe this as, again, she wanted Willow out to get Sarah's mind straight, which again I don't think is the way I would be describing this move, but where again you should be doing it more so for Sarah's loyalty. But even then, it's not a good move to begin with, where again Sarah at least has some control over Willow, at least theoretically. I mean, she really doesn't because it's Sarah, as we'll talk about, but she should be able to keep Brittany safe. Also the fact that again by making this move, again you're keeping in a showmance, you're keeping in an alliance that's almost half the house, also an alliance of pretty solid comp competitors, to where again I just think this is the wrong call. But again I can at least get her perspective, as again Willow is coming for her again in a very basic view of the game. I can at least understand why she thinks Willow is someone that she needs to take out. And really, I think a lot of the blame for this Willow move, I'm going to actually land on Sarah. How shocking. Where again, I think Sarah plays this dynamic between Brittany and Willow just all wrong, where we end up seeing Sarah essentially just give Brittany permission to put up Willow beforehand, which is obviously terrible play from Sarah, and that she was primed to be in such a good position had the Diaper Alliance been fully weakened here. Again, this would have allowed for her to have both Brittany and Willow by her side, both people wanting to take her to the end, with her also starting to build bonds, the women in the Diaper Alliance, and still having this connection to Godfrey and Bruno. Again, Sarah would have been in a pretty good position had things gone her way here, but again, something that she just completely fails to do is be able to keep Brittany and Willow from targeting each other, to the point where she doesn't even really try, and which is such a failing on her, where I really feel like some of the best players are players that are able to go deep with both of their allies, both of which taking them to the end in a spot where they're not targeting each other for most of the game. We see someone like Cody do this expertly with Enzo and Nicole and BB22, and Sarah just completely fails at that, and not even fails in the sense that she doesn't even try to do that, where she actually again encourages Brittany to do this. And I'm sure if Willow, she probably would have done the same thing, to where again it just feels like such a misguided move here from Sarah. It doesn't end up costing her a spot where she should have been pretty well positioned following this. But once Willow does end up hitting the block, it actually isn't even a guarantee that she ends up going home here, as again, still have two Diaper Alliance members on the block, though we do end up seeing the vote here go really off the rails, where while it was pretty obvious that Kevin was going home with no one really fighting for him, where despite the guys was being worried about this women's alliance, I think keeping around both Kevin and Zach would have been obviously a bit much, especially this close to the end, where both are very good at competitions, where again, you would ideally still significantly weaken the Diaper Alliance. So really the vote ends up coming down to more so saving Peely or Willow, with Peely on the offset having two defenders here out of the 5, and us seeing obviously Ashley wanting to save her, but also Godfrey, which is never really explained on the show, though Godfrey did have a pretty decent relationship with Peely at this point. Also, she was obviously the least threatening player, and also someone that I think he thought he could beat at the end and wanted to go to the end with, where again I at least get his rationale for him, all while we do end up seeing the only open Willow supporter being Sarah, who we see campaigning to Bruno and Godfrey to take Peely out, only for Godfrey to refuse, leading to Sarah making, what do you know, another massive mistake in the game and thinking that hope is gone for saving Willow, and also worries that Bruno and Zach are trying to save Kevin, and in turn puts her vote into saving Peely. Again, sealing Willow's fate here. Which, again, the concept of Sarah voting out her number one ally ends up being this, again, final, really fun turn that really makes this my favorite double/triple. But, again, this was clearly just a lot of miscommunication here. And that Willow, again, should have had the numbers to stay, where we'd end up seeing Zach wanting to keep her around, voting for her. With him, again, not trusting Kevin at this point, and also having a close personal connection to Willow, while also, again, not really having one of Peely, wanting to split up Peely and Ashley, all while Bruno also ends up saving Willow in a spot where he has a connection with her and wants to weaken the Diaper Alliance, where again, logically their votes make sense here, yet they never communicate this to Sarah, which I do fault Sarah here again, as this is a spot where again, she loses her closest ally, a spot where again, I just think she plays this all wrong. First in the fact that again, she puts her vote on Peely here, as again, she's worried about these other two votes going to Kevin, but that shouldn't be an issue for her. First in the fact that if she puts her one vote on Willow, that still makes it a 2-2-1, meaning Brittany breaks the tie and Brittany is going to vote out Kevin. So again, if she's so worried about Kevin staying in the game, again, that's something she shouldn't be worried about. She should still be saving Willow in the case that other people are saving Willow. As again, Peely getting a third vote from her doesn't ultimately matter. As again, at worst, it can be a tie with Kevin if she's not on board. But also, I think an understated fact of all this is the fact that this is just, again, another situation like the JP situation of, again, Sarah doing all this to take Kevin out of the game in a spot where Kevin actually wanted to work with Sarah at this point. And he wanted to work with Sarah to take out Zach, to where Kevin had been making strides to that in this last week, to where I actually think Kevin staying is actually better for Sarah than Peely, who again had so many other options, was never going to genuinely work with Sarah, while Kevin is essentially alone at this point if Peely goes, to where, again, I do think all this is just such a disaster for Sarah, where, again, despite her being in such a good position at the point that Brittany ends up winning this HOH, that could have put herself in the power position, she really just ends up botching all of it. She ends up leaving this HOH, again, taking out two people that actually wanted to work with her, one of which being her closest ally in the game, in a spot where she is the person to seal her fate, and leaves this week being the biggest target on the board for most of the house. Literally all of the Diaper Alliance, plus Bruno ends up targeting her. So again, this was just such a wasted opportunity. But again, we get to the eviction, which ends up having this really awkward moment of like Kevin being told he's evicted first, only for him to be told to stay there, while they end up saying the other result. But again, Willow ends up being evicted here and is clearly devastated and storming out of the house. And we do see this like really funny dichotomy as they both exit the house, with Kevin jumping around trying to pump the crowd up, all while Willow's clearly disheveled. Wait, with that, let's talk about the actual boots here. Starting off with Kevin, and obviously this isn't the last we'll see of Kevin. Kevin will return BB Can 5 and have a probably more notable run there, but still, again, massive character on BB Can 3. Mind you, again, felt like it was because the producers loved Kevin and really wanted to shove him down our throats, where we just got so much content of him, even at points where he's just completely unnecessary. But again, he is a fun narrator. He is someone that clearly gets that he's on a reality show and tries to play up to that, to where, and while certain aspects of him can come off as very game body, I did think he was a fun personality here. And again, I think had the potential to be a solid player. Mind you, I think he actually spends a lot of the game not being trusted, ends up being on the bottom for most of it, ends up being blindsided multiple times. Like, I don't think his game is particularly good by the end, but I do think he is a player that clearly knew the show pretty well, played the game very strategically, and was doing a lot to set up his end game that, again, he just never was able to get to. But again, did end up leaving this season being a massive fan favorite, to where, again, wasn't a surprise to see him come back for BB Can 5. And we then move on to Willow, who I think probably has one of the saddest evictions in the history of the show. Again, being taken out again by her closest ally, and being in a spot where she's so emotional on her way out, which is so opposed to the way that Willow is outside that, where Willow is just like really over the top, positive figure throughout most of the season. Where, again, her being sniped out of the game in this way was kind of sad to see. And again, Willow's another one of these people that, again, I think was starting to pick up the game a bit. I mean, while she was, again, undyingly loyal to Sarah, I do feel like she was kind of actively playing multiple sides at this point and doesn't really do too much wrong on her way out here. Again, she ends up being taken out just due to complete misunderstanding because they didn't have much time to really communicate. Now, again, obviously she could have done better in maintaining this relationship with Brittany and at least getting Sarah to try to maintain the relationship with Brittany for her. But again, I think outside that, Willow, again, is a fine enough player. One I probably went higher on through the process of making this video, but also played it and really get to do too much during her run here, to where, while a very likable presence, she's one that didn't really bring too much to the show. But then we get to week 8, where who would have guessed it? We get another another big twist that ends up changing the result of the entire week. But and we do start off with the flashback to the triple and us seeing the aftermath with there being a pretty massive fight here between Sarah and Bruno, which really starts this downward trajectory for Bruno's game, with it again just feeling like a point where Bruno just lost his temper for no real reason. I mean, obviously emotions were high. It was right after the triple, and you could tell that Bruno fully did believe that the women were coming for him, and he was playing very defensively at this point, where we do end up seeing Sarah calling him out for not working with Sarah and Ashley, only for Bruno just to completely explode here. So we do see them getting each other's faces, and again, this is a very intense fight here, and Bruno trying to deny that he now has Zach's loyalty, which is, again, kind of dumb. And, well, again, I do think the play itself, the save Zach, was sound. The way that he ends up handling it here, especially in lashing out at Sarah, again, was just all wrong, and completely severing this tie now between the two. It would have been very beneficial for really the both of them to continue to work together to weaken the Diaper Alliance, who are still 3 of the final 7 here. While also this ends up being, again, such a massive fight. Again, probably the biggest fight of this entire season. Probably one of the most intense, like, screaming matches in all of BB Can. Again, one that ends up harming both of their games here. Them never being able to repair their relationship following this, and also, just in general, this was also not a great look for Bruno. Sure, while he does come off as this really hardcore gamer for most of the season, he does end up having these like emotional lapses here that do end up harming his game. But anyway, we get to the HOH, it being medieval themed, with Brittany coming out dressed as a dominatrix for some reason. But again, we get an interesting style of endurance comp where the players get to choose between 3 different endurance challenges, each of which having their different pros and cons. One being BB's version of Get a Grip, be holding onto a pole, and another one essentially being the Final Immunity Challenge for Survivor Fiji, of hanging onto a bar while being on a ramp. Well, there's another that basically has you having to bounce a ball while wearing a pillory. Again, all very different skill sets, but also interestingly, you're able to trade with other players, which does actually add social strategy aspects to the challenge, which obviously does greatly disfavor Sarah here, which again, don't love, but I do like the aspect of, again, you being able to swap with another player and adding this interesting strategy of what challenges you should do at what times. And again, conceptually, I think this is a really fun challenge. But again, we do end up seeing swapping between Ashley and Zach and Bruno, and giving them a massive advantage. And it really does come down to Ashley and Bruno, with Ashley pulling out the win here, putting the Diaper Alliance in power once again, because we obviously needed that. Oh, we see Godfrey throwing the HOH here, as expected, to where this really ends up being the point where we start to get this like Godfrey mastermind edit, again, giving rules on how to throw a competition, and we later see him getting this segment about making deals with each of the pairs in the house, making a final 3 of Bruno and Zach, a final 3 of Sarah and Brittany, and a final 3 of Ashley and Peely, with Godfrey really playing this endgame pretty well in terms of positioning and trying to get himself to the end, to which the edit does back him up in this spot and how actively he's doing these things, though despite that, again, he never ends up really garnering the respect for how he plays this portion of the game. Though, to be fair, that also adds to why he was navigating relatively cleanly in this endgame, and why people wanted to take him deeper is because they just generally didn't look at him as a threat at this point. And again, it really just goes to show just how little respect people had for his game, despite the fact that from what we were seeing, he was playing extremely well and was managing his threat level better than most other people on this season. This obviously has the issue just never being able to convince them that he was actually playing this intentionally. Though with that said, he does end up being nominated this week as a pawn alongside Sarah, as again, Sarah's the mastermind, which, yeah, the mastermind of getting her own number 1 ally out of the game. Or genuinely, what else did she mastermind on this season? But again, it does seem like a misplay here to not nominate Sarah and Brittany together, though again, to be fair, what skin is it off Ashley's back if Brittany does win the veto and uses it, where again, she would have to put up Bruno on the block? Oh no, which actually isn't that bad of a move for Ashley, and actually realistically probably should be the move that she should be doing right now, where Sarah and Brittany are at least people that have these like working connection with Ashley, while Bruno is somebody that is more so working with Zach and is again a number for Zach, so where again, I think she should be wanting to split them up. So again, I get the concept of this, because considering again, Sarah and Brittany are a duo, while Bruno is again more so alone, considering the fact that Zach obviously is more close to Ashley and Peely than he is to Bruno. But again, still to me, this felt like a spot where this just gives Zach more options than her for down the road, to which this is the week where we finally get to see more of Ashley's game on the show, in the fact that we end up seeing that her real final 2 is with Peely over Zach, which again, obviously the correct call there, as she knows Zach would beat her at the end. And while I do think that had they gotten to the final 3, she likely would have cut Zach over Peely in that position, I do think over time, Ashley's game probably gets propped up a bit too much for how she approaches this end game, where again, on the rewatch and doing research on the feeds, it really does lower my opinion of Ashley's game, and that, again, I assume that Ashley was kind of using Zach, and to be fair, she does talk about how she's using him as a shield, but again, I was assuming she was planning on cutting him towards the end game, where again, following the feeds, like, it seemed like Ashley was pretty unwilling to cut Zach until literally the last second, even then was kind of hesitant even if she would do that, to where again, she talks about how she would feel bad and how she felt like he deserved it more. Again, I come out of this rewatch being kind of disappointed in Ashley's game, where again, I think she should have been pretty resolute in wanting to take Zach out at some point during the end game. And again, making this Bruno move here would have been a move to weaken Zach, which I do think is something that I wish she would have done to really illustrate that she wasn't just playing to Zach's benefit. But on the edit here, Zach does end up getting a lot of the credit for Ashley's HOH, coming up with the plan to put up Sarah and Godfrey, all while we also see Sarah trying to campaign to Ashley and Zach breaking up that conversation, leading to the typical Sarah content for complaining about how no one's letting her play the game. But anyway, we get to the veto comp, which ends up being a Ramada sponsored challenge. Thank God. Part 1 has them being shown locations and them having to pinpoint where they are on the map. So that's something. But again, the number that they get right here determines how many balls they get for part 2, which has them playing pachinko, aka an entire challenge that comes down to luck of them having to get their ball in a certain letter, and the last to do that each round is out. And what do you know? Sarah wins a luck-based challenge and is so proud of herself for doing something. Again, winning a luck-based challenge, which also, again, very apt considering her entire game. But again, this was a spot where she did not win the veto here. She was going home, and she does end up saving herself here. But really, again, there was no real suspense in who the renom was going to be, with Zach getting the credit for pushing Brittany as the renom, which Ashley goes along with, which, again, I don't think is the right play for her. But again, we do end up seeing them say that nothing other than a miracle will turn this around for Sarah and Brittany, which about that, we get to the final those twists of the season. Despite there actually being a double next week, to where again, that's kind of a twist also, but either way. And also again, twist here because we couldn't go a week without some sort of twist of some sort. But this is where we get the reveal of the secret power under the have-not room, with it finally coming to play, with Canada now having to vote for who they want to have an opportunity to get it, with them unshockingly picking Sarah and Brittany, the two underdogs of the season, who were clearly the fan favorites during the season. But again, this gets revealed to the house as them having been voted in to be have-nots for the week, as they needed them in the have-not room. Again, I do think it's kind of lame, the fact that all that foreshadowing earlier about the power underneath the have-not room just leads to the players themselves having nothing to do with it, and it just not being revealed until production decides to do it here. So again, it's not like the secret power veto, where again, I think that was very satisfying to see, again, someone find the clue and then go on this scavenger hunt. I feel like with this, it's simply just, hey, you can have this power now. But really, this ends up furthering the underdog content for Sarah and Brittany, and them now thinking that Canada hates them, as why else would they vote them to be in the have-not room? And really hamming this up in the confessional and saying that, what's the point if Canada hates us? Where again, should be pretty clear what's going on here, to where even the other players picked up on something being off of this. But again, we end up seeing them sobbing over being have-nots, with this like dark filter being put over the footage, which was funny. But at this point where the hatch from underneath finally opens up, and it's a safe, with them having to now solve a combo and to get the power, which is, again, meant to be this competition. But again, obviously it doesn't matter, as it's two allies here that got voted in, a spot where Sarah had already won the veto, to where clearly Brittany was going to be the one that needed the power itself. And what do you know? Brittany gets it. But also, again, really funny this is all happening while everyone is clearly under lockdown in the HOH room without Sarah and Brittany, to where, again, that should have added even more sus here. But and Brittany gets this unprecedented power here, never seen in the Big Brother house, I guess, that being 2 safely necklaces that she can use to save both nominees at the eviction ceremony and pick the replacement nom, aka coup d'etat, which again we've literally seen on BBUS. Also distributed in a very similar way to how it was in BBS through a fan vote, to where, again, it's funny how they act like you've never seen this before, when it's like, I kind of have. Bubsy, again, this ends up being a really overpowered twist here, giving Brittany a lot of power, literally just because she's a fan favorite, which, again, just feels like the producers putting their fingers into the game a bit too much here. And while, again, we did end up seeing this be used in BBUS, that doesn't mean it's good. Where, again, this allows Brittany to save herself in a spot where, again, she was dead man walking. She was going home here. And instead of going home, she gets to instead nearly handpick who goes home instead, which is another very lucky circumstance for Sarah. Again, another spot where Sarah gets greatly benefited from a twist. Again, was given to an ally of hers. Again, allowing Brittany to stay in the game, giving her an extra number for longer in the game. Can win competitions to help her. But again, the Eviction episode does largely focus around what Brittany's going to do with the power, where obviously we don't need to focus on Brittany trying to stay and get the votes because we know she's safe and wasn't going home anyway, to where, again, we do end up seeing her have all these conversations that don't matter, but again, get propped up as Brittany trying to test them to figure out what she's going to do with the power, and showing her picking Godfrey's brain and make sure they have the same targets, as if she wasn't going to save him. Again, that felt really dumb. But again, we see her talk about how Zach Zach is the glue that keeps the other side together and that she could be taking him out with the power, only not do that. And this is being followed by us seeing Sarah and Brittany trying to talk game with Bruno, again, not handling this well, and not even acting interested when Brittany is campaigning to him. And we end up seeing Sarah and Bruno fight once again, which, again, realistically, this shouldn't have mattered in this round. And you can surely say that Bruno was screwed over. This power ends up being used to help take him out. But I will say also from Bruno, this is terrible play. I mean, especially with, again, Sarah being guaranteed to be here next week. You're just making, again, more of an enemy of someone that can be HOH the following week. And again, obviously, we've seen Godfrey make an enemy of Zach, and that worked to his favor. But again, that's not really what Bruno is doing here. Again, he just legitimately is pissed off at Sarah, and it's a spot where, again, we're so close to the end of the game, you don't really need this style of shield anymore. While, again, I do think he gets unlucky in the fact that this power ends up being used in this round to take him out, he still ends up playing most of this round pretty wrong, to where, again, this just leads to Brittany using this power to get rid of Bruno instead of Zach, which is pretty insane. This spot where this is another pretty bad move for Sarah and Brittany, where, again, while Bruno was fully against them, and again, wouldn't entertain a conversation with them, Zach also was never going to work with them. Sure, yeah, he pretended a bit more to be with them, but again, he had no incentive to be working with them. He also had Ashley and Peely by his side who were willing to take him to the end. Where, again, to not take out Zach over Bruno, who, again, has nobody in the game at this point, is just another wasted opportunity that just so happens to work out for him because they get a very fortunate HOH result. But again, this does end up screwing Bruno over, who was one of the big frontrunners to win a jury vote at this point. And I remember at the time I was very frustrated at this, though. I think realistically looking at his game now, I don't think he was that well positioned to get to the end anyway. I think he would have needed to win out the way. I don't think anybody was planning on actually taking him to the end itself. To where I actually think the person that this screws over even more is Zach, who, again, seemed to be pretty well positioned had Brittany gone home, where while Sarah and Godfrey would have been targeting him, at that point he still would have had Bruno around as a potential shield for him. And again, he obviously still has Ashley and Peely wanting to go to the end of him, while also, again, in this world having Bruno still taking him towards the end, to where, again, this significantly ends up weakening Zach's position in the game, where I would argue that he's more screwed over in this position than Bruno. Now, before the eviction, we do end up getting a jury segment, which felt pretty rushed, but again, we did get a number of tiffs here from, again, Cindy being annoyed at Bobby, Willow also being annoyed at Bobby for being the one to spread the women's alliance, which Willow ends up blaming him for being the thing that got her out for whatever reason. Even though, again, she was taken out over Peely. But also we ended up seeing Kevin being upset to be on the jury with these players that played terrible games, and he doesn't deserve to be here because obviously Kevin is such a great player in this spot. Anyway, we get to the eviction where Brittany uses her power and Bruno just instantly knowing that he's screwed. And finally, she ends up putting up Zach here on the block as a pawn, which is kind of funny to see them use Zach as a pawn this late in the game. But again, it does end up guaranteeing Bruno goes home, as again, Peely won't vote for him, and again, they obviously want him out as well. Which, by the way, I should also mention the fact that it is pretty insane that Brittany also gets to vote here after using this power, and also has the ability to play into HOH following this, which is, again, just really overpowered. I mean, like, again, I talk about how the coup d'etat in itself is overpowered. This is essentially coup d'etat with also those added benefits, which is just insane. But again, Bruno ends up getting out here unanimously, with him saying as he leaves that Sarah is a good gamer and got him, which is, again, a weird reaction considering how anti-Sarah he ends up being on the jury. But also, it's like, what did she do here to make you think she's a good gamer? Where, again, I feel like almost everything she does here is wrong. But either way, we lose Bruno. And Bruno is someone that, obviously, again, we will also see back on BB Can 5, and one that I am kind of conflicted on him on the show. I think Bruno is someone that, again, in post-show, I've seen him in his live streams and playing games with other people, and he's a really fun, chaotic presence there. On the show itself, though, he's very tame. I do think he actually plays the game in kind of a boring way. He tries to play in this, like, very bomb squad sort of way of getting this alliance of bros and creating this, like, onion structure, but again, it doesn't really work out for him on the season because of how dynamic the gameplay ends up being. But again, I do think he's a mostly reserved character that has some pretty fun moments at points. Again, I think him using the veto on Zach is still insane. I think he is a player that is willing to make these really bold moves when necessary. And again, I think he's a really interesting player. But when I remember coming on this season, I never expected to see Bruno back on BB Can. Like, while I thought, again, they liked him for sure, I did not expect him to be like a top priority for him to bring him back immediately. But again, I'm happy they did, considering I do feel like he's someone that plays a very big, bold game. And while, again, my overall takeaway from this actual rewatch here is actually I'm a bit lower on Bruno as a player. I do think he plays his final week pretty poorly. I think also looking at his trajectory through the game, while, again, he had a good setup at the beginning, he does end up being kind of on the bottom for a lot of the game. And to be fair, a lot of that's based around comp results. But again, he ends up losing a lot of his allies along the way, with him essentially being like the last standing of his allies, which, again, is impressive that he was able to be that, especially considering he was probably the biggest threat of the bunch. Again, in comparison to the likes of Bobby and Greg, again, he probably was the person the most likely to go on to win the game. It was the one that playing the game the most actively. Yeah, again, he's able to survive over all of them. But again, I do still think his game on the season's one where, again, he kind of, outside of a power position for most of it, but is able to, again, make these big, bold plays and taking out JP and saving Zach at points. But plays somebody that, again, was just kind of dangling on the bottom for a decent chunk of it. And also, like, should have been taken out during the JP boot round. Again, that was a spot where that was the plan for most of that round until Cindy came back to where, again, I think he gets fortunate there. To where, yeah, I think my opinion of Bruno's game did go down on the rewatch here. Yeah, I do think Bruno is still a really interesting player that plays a very bold game, and I think that was something I at least respected from him. But then we move on to week 9. Finally, a normal week of the show, outside the fact that there's a double at the end. We get the next HOH here, which has the players sitting in coffins for 100 minutes of hell, which becomes a staple in BB Can, a modification of a combo that we saw in BBUS, where their job is to buzzer when they think 100 minutes have passed, with the closest ending up being the winner. But yeah, we end up seeing them have to sit in a glass box and begin distractions over time. Distractions like a remix of Greg talking. Also, a clown that follows Ashley around for some reason. Also, they get messages from home, and obviously they have to have worms added in, because obviously. But we do end up seeing Zach dropping out pretty early, with Brittany dropping out immediately afterwards, really being a negative of this challenge. The fact that the majority wanted to, they could very much attempt to ice out the minority here by pushing their buttons right after the minority player, locking in, which just makes it very unlikely the minority would end up winning this challenge. But we do proceed to see Peely quit once again, but again, not because she thought it was time, but because she's genuinely quit, which is apt, leaving only Godfrey and Sarah, with there actually being a decent amount of time to spare here, leading to Sarah actually making a deal with Godfrey for him to drop out, which was interesting to see in this style of challenge. But again, Sarah ends up getting the win here, her first more skill-based comp win, so good for her, but also in turn ends up being very fortunate for her in allowing her to course correct for the previous mistakes she's made through the last few rounds, and that she really only has one move to make here in targeting Zach, which couldn't really mess up, and obviously she ends up nominating Zach and Ashley together, as again, anything else would have been idiotic. But this here we do get a segment about Sarah and Brittany's connection, and about how they've been together since day one. Again, this super loyal alliance. Again, Sarah surely never considered turning against, but again, they do end up solidifying their final two, which again has Sarah in a pretty decent position at this point, where she clearly ends up being Brittany at the end, and is likely to win in most situations, emphasis on most. Again, most of the jurors looked at her as this mastermind, and a good chunk of them also had these good personal bonds with her, which really ends up being the strong suit of Sarah's game, the way that she's able to have these like undyingly loyal people to her at points, and even the ones that aren't, just assuming that she's the one running the show, even though she isn't, and even if she was making the wrong calls at almost every turn. But either way, we also get a task here from Pizza, where we have them playing in pairs and have to test pizza and decide what toppings are on the pizzas. Again, this was boring. But Godfrey and Ashley end up winning $500 gift cards from Pizza. Again, what a great reward. And we also get the family visit here for the season, with Ashley and Godfrey getting to see their loved ones for 2 minutes in the backyard. Again, all boring. But also they get a pizza party and letters from home. Who would have guessed that was also boring? Also, we end up seeing Godfrey get a mission on his own. They're given items that have no purpose to them, and Godfrey's tasked with just raising confusion, which really just felt like production wanting to troll the players here, where they end up even like leaking in audio of Bruno, trying to pretend like Bruno's returning to the game. And again, all this is just such a waste of time. But we get lots of talk before the veto about if Peely wins, then she'll use the veto and Godfrey will go home in that spot. Again, making it seem like this is going to happen. But I mean, come on, it's Peely. I think she's going to win this veto, though. Again, this ends up being one of the few danger points for Godfrey in this endgame stretch. Again, we get to the veto comp, which ends up being sponsored by Show Me, because we definitely didn't have enough sponsored challenges here. To which they end up being shown clips from shows, and then the placement of their posters, and then have to recreate it. And again, typical style challenge. And who would have guessed it? Peely struggles and gives up again. I never would have guessed that. Well, Ashley ends up winning here. Again, starting this impressive streak of veto wins for her. But with that, again, Zach's essentially a goner. Though we do end up seeing Zach trying to put together this like massive scheme of getting Ashley and Peely to make an all-girls alliance to trick Sarah into putting Godfrey up instead of Peely, and that they'll pretend to vote out Zach. And to be fair, I mean, we've seen Sarah do dumber things in the past, but obviously Sarah ends up seeing through this, and this doesn't really go anywhere. But again, I'll at least credit Zach for at least trying here, though. Again, he didn't really have the best soldiers to try to enact this plan, where we do see Peely accidentally leak to Sarah that she'd be sending out Godfrey over Zach during the conversation. I'll always see Ashley never look into Sarah's eyes during the entire conversation, which didn't help either. But finally, we get this pretty contrived segment about how Ashley could use the veto on Zach, but it's like, again, that was never really happening. And she obviously used it on herself, and Peely ends up being the Renom, as she should be, though we do end up seeing Zach doing Godfrey here and calling out Sarah and Brittany, saying that he's coming after him next week, which, again, at least he tried, but again, it's way too late for that. Especially when, like, if I'm the others, I'll be way more scared about a Zach-Ashley duo than a Sarah-Brittany duo, or even, again, the possibility of an Ashley-Peely duo. But, again, Zach just had to go in this spot. Which, following this, we see Zach saying that the diaper is done. Sometimes diapers don't hold up, and they don't last as much as they used to, and they've taken the last shit in the diaper, and shit just got everywhere. It's like, what is this metaphor? It's so funny that he's, like, saying this while, like, this, like, somber music is playing. And beyond this, Godfrey is set up as a swing vote, with people fully believing that Ashley would save Zach in this spot, which, again, I think she would have at least considered it if Zach was able to get another vote, but again, he's not able to. And again, definitely would have if he was against anybody but Peely, but again, against Peely here, it felt like a foregone conclusion where, we get to the eviction, where we do get the unanimous Zach vote, during which we get big cheers from the audience here as Zach is voted out, and it's very clear from the audience that they were very much rooting for this Sarah, Brittany, Godfrey side of things, and that the Diaper Alliance was not particularly popular. But with that, again, we lose Zach, and Zach is such an interesting player on this season, as I do think he is one of the best players on this season. I do think he played a strong early game, again, bit too obviously to where everyone knew he was playing such a good game, but again, I think he played well there, and he somehow was able to really scrape on by after making, again, a colossal mistake during the JP vote round, which again was just terrible gameplay there, but again, he had secured these bonds with the Hyper Alliance well enough. He also had Bruno saving, which too, for again, I think is like kind of a Deus Ex Machina to a degree, where I don't think he did much work to get Bruno to save him, but at that point, again, he's in a pretty good position from a Final 7 on, only to get pretty unfortunate comp results / twists to where he gets taken out. But again, he was at the final 6 in a world where Ashley and Peely wanted to take him to the end, in a spot where he definitely beats them at the end, where, again, I think that's a pretty good position to be in for someone like Zach, someone that is such an openly obvious threat from the very beginning. While he obviously made a lot of mistakes along the way, I do think Zach actually comes out of this season looking like one of the better players of the season, despite the fact that he also is a pretty boring character, where I think he brought kind of nothing to the show, just kind of a dud entertainment-wise. But again, I do think he largely comes out of this looking like a pretty solid player, but one that, again, never needed to see return down the road. But with that, we then get to the double eviction, which was boring, though at this point, again, Godfrey was set up pretty well, being in the middle of these two duos, where, again, Sarah and Brittany were going after Ashley and Peely, and Ashley and Peely were going after Sarah and Brittany, to where Godfrey is obviously going to throw this entire round here, a round that essentially comes down to just comps. But a HOH comp is a table maze that was extremely hard to follow from a viewer perspective, but Brittany ends up winning there, guaranteeing that one of Ashley or Peely are going home. Ashley in particular, she doesn't win the veto, and what do you know? Ashley wins her second veto in a row, and what is a pretty interesting comp, actually, of it being a modification of the slip and slide challenge, though on a smaller scale, and instead of running back and forth, it has them sliding back and forth on this, like, wheel board. And we actually do see Peely being in the lead throughout the majority of it, again, being one of the few comps that Peely could have won, only for her to struggle to get the ball out at the end, where she clearly needed one more trip, while Ashley makes that decision to go for one more trip and pulls out the win there, which ends up sealing Peely's fate here, as, again, while Godfrey goes up as the Renom, again, there's no other situation other than a tied vote here. Again, Brittany and Sarah were not going to let Peely and Ashley both get to the final 4, to where, again, Brittany ends up being the tiebreaker here and ends up saving Godfrey, which, again, she should. Again, they're making the right call. Shocking. Or obviously Godfrey's much more amenable to working with them, and it also separates Ashley and Peely. Again, not really much to really say about this double outside of some weird pacing issues here, and that the episode actually does end shorter than your typical episode, where it really feels like they kind of rush through double so quickly that where we end up having like an extended interview at the end, and also for some reason a jury segment. That was actually kind of interesting in the sense that we do see Bruno coming in hot, throwing Sarah under the bus, telling Willow that Sarah got her out, which clearly Bruno trying to make Willow bitter against Sarah. And we do see Willow being devastated here, only for Kevin to prop this up in confessional, saying, what a great move from Sarah. Which, like, how? Like, legitimately how? I genuinely don't understand how he can react to this. The fact that Willow, someone undyingly loyal to Sarah, at the final 9, is voted out by Sarah, and you're thinking, you know what? Incredible move. Now, again, there's things you could say, and this is, okay, Willow is someone that would advocate for her in the jury, but again, is that a guarantee when you're the one that blindsided her in this spot? Well, also, it's not like this is intentional anyway, and I do question, does the jury even know that this was intentional? Because obviously the way that Bruno frames it is as if it was, because again, he's trying to paint this negativity on Sarah, but the reality is that, again, Sarah did not do this purposely. And I do wonder if they had known that, and I wonder if that would have changed their overall view of Sarah. But again, this does end up showing Bruno playing very hard in the jury house, where we have had reports show that he did a lot of campaigning for Godfrey while there, and went on this like pretty anti-Sarah campaign, where while we do have situations like this in other seasons that work in players' favors of having a champion for them on the jury, this actually seems to work in the opposite way here, where again, people were actually turned off by the fact that Bruno was fighting so hard for Godfrey, especially in comparison to Sarah, which led to a lot of the diapers in particular being lower on Godfrey's game, where I do feel like this is an aspect of jury management that, again, is just very difficult to gauge, where a lot of people talk about jury management as if it is this very concrete concept. Yeah, I think this is just definitive proof that, again, you can do the right things, again, send someone like Bruno to the jury, one that came off as this very strong and at points influential player during the season, send him to the jury as an advocate for you, and instead he ends up burning more of your jury chances than helping. But either way, by the end of this, we obviously lose Peely, and Peely was kind of a dud. I don't feel like Peely brought anything to the show. I thought she was a boring character, and I thought she was a nothing player, to where, again, nothing against Peely as a person. Like, from what I've seen from Peely post-show, she seems like a really nice person. Someone that, again, I know followed the show for years after, and again, would appear on RGP at points. And again, she was a very likable presence there, but just someone that, again, at this point, again, very young, I don't think really knew the game particularly well. Just did not really have the skill set to do that much in the game, while also just, again, brought nothing to the show outside of her showmance with Kevin, and even then, I personally don't care about that. So again, I really just don't feel like Peely is someone that had much going for her on this season. But then we get to the final 4 round, which ends up being another round entirely determined by competitions. There's not much strategically really going on here, but we do get some focus early on Godfrey saying that he'll never forget that Brittany saved him and that she's his guardian angel, saying that now he has to step it up for Brittany by winning HOH, which doesn't make any sense. This doesn't help Brittany at all, which again is funny that they pretend like this HOH has any power, but it does seem like Godfrey was genuine here and wanting to go to the end of Brittany at this point, which, I mean, isn't the worst case scenario for him. Again, definitely better than Sarah, at least, the person he ends up actually taking, though he clearly does need one of Sarah or Brittany out by the end of this round, as again, going to final 3 with them together is a pretty bad position for him to be in, where he essentially needs to win that final HOH. But again, we get to the HOH, which is a Q&A, where we see Brittany rooting for Sarah, and it's like, you shouldn't be, as again, that means that you're way more vulnerable. Again, you should be rooting for Godfrey or even Ashley at this point to be rooting it out. As really, actually, if both of them end up winning the HOH, you're pretty lock safe, with both of them probably taking out Sarah over you. But again, we do end up seeing Sarah proceeding to win, being another of her genuine comp wins on the season. And we see her talk about how she has the ultimate underdog story, and shows that if you work hard, you can do anything. Yes. And she definitely worked so hard to get Brittany that coup d'etat and win the triple eviction, and for Cindy to finesse, come back into the game being explicitly told to work with her and take out the people that actually wanted to work with her in the game and get saved by a luck-based veto, and now for her to win a quiz comp. Again, it was only hard work that mattered. But here we also get focus on Ashley, talking about how she's lost all of her allies and says that Godfrey is all she has in the game, where, again, this puts Godfrey in a very beneficial position once again. Again, being able to play the middle, where no one ends up planning on voting him out during this round. Now, obviously, he had to be very fortunate in the fact that Ashley did not win that HOH, as had that been the case, then he is actually probably the most likely person to end up going by the end of this round. But again, where it stands now, Ashley looks at Godfrey as her only ally and will obviously want to split up Brittany and Sarah, while Brittany also has a better connection to Godfrey. And Ashley is also just a bigger threat in competitions and had more assumed win equity due to her friends on the jury, to where, again, Godfrey was, again, in a pretty lock-safe position, where I do think Godfrey ends up playing this optimally, which is, again, a funny contrast to how he was talking before the HOH. But again, he talks about now wanting to take Brittany out, and we see him trying to turn Sarah against Brittany, which, again, wasn't happening at this point. But again, he was very safe in this position, even though obviously he is nominated initially against Ashley, as you would expect. But again, we get to the BB Can Awards with Gary and Nika coming in to dress them, which interesting considering their connection coming into BB Can 5, but also seeing how much production already loved Ika, to where she was someone that, again, they brought back as a guest on the following season, in a spot where this season actually didn't have that many guest appearances. But really, I think it's only John up to this point, but and Sarah ends up winning a few awards as expected, along with us also getting a favorite Godfrey speech award, where, again, that should be pretty obvious. And also, Kevin and Peely win Best Kiss. Who cares? And we also get to the start of the eviction episode with Arissa popping up on the screen to reveal that it's a surprise eviction, which why are we still acting like this is a surprise? But again, we get to the veto comp, which is a pretty interesting one where it's obviously, again, the typical Days sort of comp, but it's one where you have 2 trains, but it's a spot where you have 2 like miniature trains running around you with numbers on them, and you use those to answer your Days questions, which again, at least a cool aesthetic here, though we do end up seeing everyone struggling here, including us seeing Brittany ending up quitting the challenge well over an hour in, though Ashley ends up proceeding to win the veto once again here, her 3rd veto in a row. And with that, Brittany's obviously going to go home, and we do end up seeing Ashley and Godfrey securing a final 2, with Godfrey actually seemingly being loyal to it in the DR, which, if only. Though we do end up seeing Sarah pretending to Ashley that she would be willing to take her to the end over Brittany, which again, no one's ever going to believe. And what do you know? She ends up still voting out Brittany by the end. Before we end the episode, we actually do get the reveal of another twist, the final surprise, because we definitely needed another one. But again, it is a follow-up on the fact that we do have 10 jury members at this point, where now the final 3 will get the decision to eliminate one of those jury members, which, yeah, it's fine. Like, I really don't care that much about this twist. Now, I do feel for the juror that ends up being voted out, where, again, they think they all have a say on who's going to win most of the time, only for that to be stripped away from them at the end. And I do think it's kind of lame that someone could potentially go on to win the game based on the fact that someone lost their vote in this position, especially if they didn't go on to pick the first juror. Where also beyond that, I do find it very strange the fact that obviously the 3rd place person gets a say here on who to eliminate, which is obviously just the ramification of the scheduling of this final round, but also that makes you question, like, why do this? Or again, it's just weird that someone that is eventually going to be on the jury is someone that can determine which jury member goes out. Though I think an interesting aspect of this that, again, I'm not really sold on if this is a good thing or a bad thing, is the fact that this does end up having you have to expose what jury votes you think you have, as obviously you're going to want to fight to keep the jury votes that you think you have, while also this is now making it aware to the others what jury votes you think you have, which again can affect your threat level in the game, which I do think is a very interesting dynamic in play here of the players trying to, again, keep their people safe from being taken off the jury, but also still not make it abundantly clear to the others that they have those votes. And again, this ends up being really ripe for drama here, considering the jury ends up being made of essentially 3 different factions that support each of the 3 finalists. Again, you have the contingent of like Sarah's allies, you have the Bobby and Bruno contingent, and you have the diapers, to where each of the final 3 end up having an attachment to each of these groups. And again, this does get pretty tense here, with us seeing them first try to agree to save 2 people and then figure it out from there, only for that to lead to a lot of bickering on whether or not Sarah has Cindy with an S and Willow's votes, which again, she does, only for Godfrey to complain about how he doesn't have the guaranteed jury votes to be doing this, which, I mean, like, you do have Bobby and Bruno, but and leads to a big fight here of Ashley saying that now she's pissed, and Godfrey telling her to shut up and saying that he's willing to stay here until finale night, which I'm sure production would have allowed. But again, it ends up serving as this cliffhanger, which strangely doesn't get resolved until after the actual vote, like literally in the reunion section of the finale, which was all very strange. But obviously they ended up agreeing to take out JP. Again, obviously an easy choice there. The first juror, someone that they are not 100% sold on where he would vote. I did love this moment where, as the jury ends up watching this on finale night, we do see them mention that JP's just going to vote for whoever Zach tells him to. JP just being aghast at that, where again, it seems like even in this position, Sarah's still fully convinced that JP was just in Zach's pocket when, again, he was trying to work with you to take out Zach. But either way, we lose Brittany through this round. And again, Brittany was a fan favorite through the season, and I think you can tell why. Obviously a massive underdog, someone that, again, had these big, bold plays at points, winning these like HOHs, making these big moves, taking out Greg, taking out Kevin, attempting to take out Zach. Again, I get why she's a fan favorite. At the same time, not a particularly good player. I think one that just, again, was very passive for most of it. Would, again, just constantly complain about how, I'm being used as a pawn again. When it's like, again, maybe you could do something to change that. And to be fair, again, obviously the trend was started through a bad HOH result and that just being an easy out to nominate her. But again, I do think she very much lacked in the ability to build these social connections outside of her core group, to where, again, just no one really took her seriously. I do very much wonder about her overall win equity, where I've never really seen this confirmed anywhere about how she fares in most given situations. I'm pretty confident she loses to Sarah, but in terms of like her against Godfrey, her against Ashley, I'm not fully sure where those votes end up landing, to where, again, it feels like a weird spot where like there was definitely a point really up until like the triple where I think she was pretty dead, where I don't think she had much respect at all. But considering these late game things that end up happening in the triple and that coup d'etat, which again, I would not give her that much credit for, especially coup d'etat, considering that's literally handed to her in a spot where she was going home. Again, like, these things are things that can shift the jury's perspective to where I'm not really sure where they landed on her, but still someone that, again, I think was always kind of just the second to Sarah. I think Sarah was always a bigger front runner, and in a spot where Sarah's not even fully loyal to her through most of it, to where, again, I do think Brittany is a very lacking player, but someone that obviously comes off very likable in the show. But with that, we then get to the finale with the typical OTT intro and 10-minute recap. Where do you see him here calling Ashley the late bloomer, which I found funny. Also, Godfrey the lone wolf, and Sarah the strategist. I guess. Which, like, when? Either way, we get to part 1 of the HOH, an extremely physical comp here of having to collect dropping sand from their tanks and put it back in the top, and it's essentially this massive endurance comp of who can last the longest. Really boring, and also, again, very obvious Godfrey is going to win this, considering just how physical this was. Where, again, not a particularly fair challenge here. All part 2 ends up being, again, typical Days comp, where they have a gear-shaped puzzle, them having to solve Days questions, and it plays out kind of how we expected it would, especially considering it's not that dissimilar from the Final Four veto, where Ashley ends up winning here in a blowout. Again, her finishing this in only 4 minutes, while Sarah takes 21, with Sarah once again getting emotional that she lost again and blew it. And really, this should have been the end of Sarah's game, with Ashley and Godfrey having a final 2. And I remember at the time fully thinking that they were going to go through with that. But this is where we do get content from Sarah campaigning to Godfrey, saying that it's a social game, not just comps, so you would blow me away. Which is, I mean, like, I feel like social games, like, the one aspect of the game that I feel like you're definitely better at than Godfrey. Well, also, you really think you're that much better at comps than Godfrey? Or, again, she had these, like, endgame competition wins, but it's not like they were overly impressive. Like, I don't think anyone's, like, looking at Sarah and being like, oh my god, we gotta vote for her because of her comp wins. And also here, we proceed to see her threaten her jury vote, which almost never works, and really most of the time actually works against the person that's doing that, though obviously something changes along the way for Godfrey, where, again, we saw him at the end of the last round talking about taking Ashley to the end. So I think for me, there's a big question here of just how much credit do I give to Sarah's campaign in doing so for Godfrey's own volition, where obviously we get to part 3 with this OTT lighting setup for what is a basic quiz comp, though obviously starts this, again, bigger budget sort of setup that we get for the final comp that ends up becoming the norm for BB Can following this, though again, it ends up being another days-based Q&A, which does end up leading to sudden death, with Godfrey pulling out the win, which, considering what he does with it, he would have been better off letting Ashley win. Where we do get to his final decision, where Godfrey says that showmances have won twice in a row, and because of that, he has to vote to evict Ashley, which is a pretty mind-blowing final 3 vote off here, once again for BB Can. Again, 3 for 3 at this point, and again, surely the next one will be just as fun. But again, I really remember at the time, I was so shocked by this, where it really did feel like Sarah was a goner and was also just so blatantly the bigger jury threat in this position, as ultimately this ends up being the wrong choice for Godfrey, as we'll talk about. But again, he obviously ends up taking someone to the end that will handily beat him here, and I thought, again, just everyone seemed to know that. So again, I was surprised by the mystery that he ends up having here. Though, to be fair, I do get it on paper, where yes, Ashley does have friends on the jury. The thing is, obviously Sarah does too. Now, obviously, I do think an aspect of this is the fact that he would rather lose to Sarah, where, again, I'll give credit to Sarah there, and the fact that she cultivated a relationship with Godfrey enough to where, again, that was a factor that played in here, that he would rather lose to Sarah than to Ashley. But realistically, I do think a major aspect of this vote-off is more so just, again, on Godfrey. The fact that he was spearheading this campaign against the showmances, and this is him following through on that, and him just assuming that the diapers will vote for her, which, I mean, may be fair, but, again, I think when you count up the votes, I think it's pretty clear he has a better chance against Ashley. As again, Ashley just simply does not have as many connections to the people outside of her core group than Sarah did, where obviously Sarah had better connections to the diapers than Ashley had to Sarah contingent, to where, again, I do think this was a misguided play here, with him just outright making the wrong choice in this position. And also, I love how, like, irrational his overall explanation of it is as well, saying that, again, the last 2 winners came from showmances, when it's like, one, John and Netta weren't, again, a true showmance at the time. Oh, well, Jillian didn't really win, where I do think this is kind of a ridiculous argument here, but again, I do think this is fully something that Godfrey himself came up with on his own over something that Sarah convinced him to do, where again, I think it legitimately just comes from the fact that he was so anti-showmance the entire season. Where again, I feel like I can't really give Sarah much credit for that, though again, I think there is still credit to be given to Sarah for how he at least had this connection with Godfrey, or it might have tipped the scales a tinge in her favor, with him just feeling like she's a better opponent to end up losing to. But again, with that, we end up losing Ashley. And Ashley, again, as a player, I was a bit underwhelmed with on the rewatch here, where I feel like I always remembered Ashley as this like really strong player that gets kind of screwed over by twists. And to be fair, her positioning definitely is harmed by twists along the way. But again, I always assumed that she would be somebody that was like actively playing from behind and was going to cut Zach at the end, when it's like, I don't know if that's really the case. Like, it seems pretty clear she was definitely not going to cut him before Final 3. And even at Final 3, I don't know if she cuts him against anybody but Peely. I think she just genuinely liked Zach and wanted to go to the end of him, which I think is something I definitely criticized from the game. Also, the fact that, again, in the position that we're at, she had to, like, for sure win the last 2 vetoes of the season. Even at the Final 6, she was obviously the backup target. And even at the end, could not convince Godfrey to take her, even though that was in Godfrey's best interest. So, again, I think there's a lot of issues to be had there, especially when, like, early on in the game, it's not like she had that much influence in the game. And while she was playing the middle decently well at points, I do feel, again, Ashley's game is one that I just find kind of underwhelming at this point when looking back on it, where really I think the biggest strengths of Ashley's game is the fact that, again, she was so disfavored by how a lot of these twists and comp results end up playing out towards the end game stretch. But even then, I don't think she was playing her own benefit by the end anyway. And beyond that, again, also Ashley, not the most riveting TV character. Now, again, someone that also very young, like Peely, I don't know if she really had this like full confidence in herself to be this interesting presence on the show and play the game in an interesting way, where I think she's the type of player that if she were to play now in her 30s, I think she would be a much more interesting player. But yeah, I think her, as she was at, again, the age of 21, seemingly very innocent, I don't really feel like she ended up bringing that much to the table here from an entertainment standpoint. But again, a still solid enough player, like not a bad player by any means, but one that I do think I probably had a higher opinion of her coming into this rewatch. But with that, we're now down to the final 2, where we get to the jury roundtable, hosted by Ian Terry, which is kind of weird. The fact that they're still keeping with bringing BBUS winners in instead of bringing their own people, though obviously that will change the following season. But it's so weird that Ian just comes in and instantly roasts them and saying that he's never been to the jury house before, which, I mean, like, not yet. But I did find Ian to be just a very awkward host here, of him, again, clearly not fitting this role, where, again, this just felt so out of place. But either way, Brittany comes in, to which we end up seeing the diapers all celebrating that Ashley won another veto, all while we see Bruno being really the only one to prop up Godfrey during this roundtable, which clearly just end up seeing this jury being very divided. And now let's talk about the jury dynamics of this season, and the fact that I think this is actually probably one of the most fascinating juries in the history of not just Big Brother, but also social strategy games in general. Again, a dynamic that you very rarely see, and the fact that this is a jury comprised of 3 separate factions, each one backing one of the final 3. You had this Sarah contingent, where obviously very pro Sarah votes, Indy, Cindy, Finesse, Willow, and Brittany's of the world. Also had Bobby and Bruno, who were actively campaigning for Godfrey to win the game. You also had the former diapers in JP, who I guess doesn't matter at this point, but also, again, Kevin, Peely, and Zach, who were actively rooting for Ashley. Now, I will say, I do think Kevin is probably the one that's most up in the air of those votes for Ashley, again, while he had an alliance with Ashley and was seemingly rooting for her alongside his alliance. I do think he's also a very game-centric person who, for some reason, thought Sarah was playing the better game. But again, this is clearly a very divided jury in the fact that, again, each of these groupings have their own number 1 preference, but again, all of these groupings also not being big enough to get the majority to decide the winner, meaning that in any of these final 2 situations, the eventual winner of this season will need to pick up 2 of these 3 factions. So another interesting aspect of this is the fact that each of these factions also had a different secondary option, where, again, the pro-Sarah votes, as proven by the reunion on the morning show the following day, were more pro-Godfrey over Ashley, where all of which of Cindy, Willow, and Brittany did say at that point that they would have voted for Godfrey had there been a Godfrey-Ashley final 2. All on the Bobby Bruno side of things, obviously Bruno was very anti-Sarah, while Bobby was obviously right beside him, while also having a pretty good relationship with Ashley, to where, again, I think they would have been pro Ashley over Sarah. Oh, while the diapers, as we've seen in the real life scenario, and clear by the way they were talking about Godfrey, were pro Sarah over Godfrey. So we're going to be mixing all these factors together. The fact that the jury had 3 different factions, along with also having 2 different sets of priorities coming into the final vote, it does lead to this being one of the most open final 3s in the history of social strategy games, where really all 3 of these final 3 could have won had they taken the right person to the end, but also could have lost if they taken the other option, where, again, as we see in real life, Sarah beats Godfrey with a combination of the Sarah contingent plus the diaper votes. Oh, well, again, we do end up seeing in the morning show the following day that Godfrey likely beats Ashley, likely getting the votes of Bobby and Bruno, and picking up the likes of Cindy, Finesse, Willow, and Brittany. Now, I know Bruno has said in years since that he doesn't think that's actually what would have happened and that he thinks Godfrey would have lost either way. But again, literally on the reunion today following this, the jury was asked how they would have voted in this situation, and they did say it would have been a 5-4 vote, to where, again, I still tend to believe that's what would have happened here, which, again, shows Godfrey actively making the wrong choice in that final decision. But also, interestingly here, if we somehow got a Ashley-Sarah final 2, which, to be fair, was never happening, as both Sarah and Ashley were taking Godfrey to the end, which in turn actually means that Ashley's game was pretty doomed coming into this final 3, with her likely losing against Godfrey. But again, either way, in that scenario, it does seem like Ashley might pull out the win here with the votes of, again, the Diapers and Kevin, Peely, and Zach, but also Bobby and Bruno. Now, again, as I said before, I do think this is a bit less secure, as Sarah, again, does have 4 locked-in jury votes in Cindy, Finesse, Willow, Brittany, and Godfrey. And as I mentioned, Kevin is someone that I think is willing to swing here, where while, again, he did seem to be alongside his alliance and rooting for Ashley during a roundtable, he is also, again, extremely complimentary of Sarah's game while on the jury, to where, again, I do think this is a vote that could go either way, but again, it does set up this very interesting scenario where really all 3 of the final 3 here could have theoretically won against one of their opponents, but also lost against the other, which, again, is something that you very rarely see in social strategy games. Really the only other final 3 situation I can think of on the top of my head that this is a similar case for something like Survivor All-Stars. I think it's very likely there that obviously we see Amber beat Rob probably beats Jenna, while Jenna probably beats Amber. And again, I think this is a very similar case, though I think this jury is also way more dynamic than that, where really that's a spot where essentially it all comes down to Sheehan, Kathy. This is like big swing votes. This is a position where pretty much everybody is a swing vote, just because, again, it's really just these 3 different factions voting together, and the entire faction being a swing vote, and depending on which of the players they end up backing, don't end up being in the final 3. But again, in the position that we do have here, this is pretty much a foregone conclusion. But again, we get jury questioning, which doesn't matter, and I think it's a shame that we don't even get opening speeches here, as obviously that would have given Godfrey a better chance here, considering he's perpetuity to give these really iconic speeches, though really I don't think it would have mattered by the end, and I don't really feel like he answers the questions here particularly well here, where again we have Cindy Finesse clearly wanting him to just admit to the fact that he wouldn't have survived without her campaigning for him during the JP vote, only for him to not really give her due there. And again, we really just see him not have proper time to explain his game, just being able to say that there was method to his madness, where obviously, again, this is a criticism in the fact that, again, they all knew that this was the type of jury question they were going to get. This is the way that had been for years at this point, to where, while I do think Godfrey is someone that, again, I think if he was able to properly explain his game during a more proper, lengthy jury questioning in this current position, he was screwed, and he should have been playing to account for that, where while I do think Godfrey does very well in positioning himself to get to the end, he simply just does not make his game apparent enough to gain that respect by the end without needing, again, an extensive amount of time to explain his game, which, again, he's just simply not going to get, to where he simply, again, just seemed to lack that ability to make the jury aware how intentional he was playing along the way. And as all, while Sarah gets softball questions, as, again, she's obviously going to win in this specific scenario. And we get to the jury voting, where Cindy Finesse says that her vote is secured with an S. And we have Zach saying that he's voting for one of the most phenomenal games in Big Brother ever, which I guess. And Brittany says that her vote is no emotion, strictly best gameplay, which also, I guess. Again, we get to the reunion, where again we get the reveal of Jordan getting voted out of the jury, with him even being forced to leave the jury box and sit with the pre-jurors, which felt pretty unnecessary. And here they end up also revealing Jordan's vote, which is a vote for Sarah, which kind of sapped all the tension here, as Jordan was set up as like one of these main swing votes coming into it. But we do end up getting a really boring reunion here, leading to the 7-2 Sarah win, which from a storytelling perspective is obviously a satisfying conclusion, in the sense that obviously she was this big underdog, this fan favorite, and she pulls out the win by the end. Now, again, I just wish she was a better player that was able to do that, where while she does have strengths in her game, it really did feel like her game is really just a comedy of errors that has her being course corrected through a lot of lucky situations, to where when assessing gameplay here, this is just a very lackluster showing from her. And again, not to say that Godfrey played perfectly, as again, he also has a decent amount of flaws, but I do think he played the game in a more consistent way, in a way that didn't require as much luck. Sarah, again, just seems to make bad move after bad move and stumbles her way to the end through very fortunate circumstances. So again, I was never particularly impressed with the Sarah win. Again, being disappointed Godfrey didn't win at the time. And I do think even re-experiencing the season here and refamiliarizing myself with how the season plays out, I think it makes this jury decision that much more frustrating, to where, again, we see the jury just continuously hype up how Sarah is this mastermind. Despite the fact that, again, I struggle to think of even a single thing she masterminded across the season, to where I don't even know how she had that perception outside the fact that she's a super fan with glasses. Or even from an inside view of the game, I feel like you should be picking up on the fact that she is being very benefited by these twists that constantly happen. And is constantly being targeted, which, to be fair, I mean, some people would credit her for, again, having this massive target and surviving to the end, but again, I don't, especially considering she didn't really survive a lot of that due to social strategy means. Again, I find this ending to be kind of lackluster, but it doesn't really affect my overall opinion on the season. Again, I'm more of a journey over the destination sort of guy, where, again, I still think it is a very fun season, and even in itself, obviously, Sarah winning is a very interesting storyline, just one obviously not for me. Again, that's the end of BB Can 3. Now let's talk about the finalists. Starting off with Godfrey. Again, I think played a very fun game on this season. Played one where he was kind of on the bottom for a decent chunk of it, but was able to be this like very scrappy underdog, but doing it in, again, a way that was very social strategy focused. Again, not in the way that, like, Sarah and Brittany were able to navigate through the game through, again, having twists and powers handed to them. Where I feel like Godfrey's in this position here where, again, he essentially plays modification of Dr. Will's game from BB2, which, to be fair, again, is not a game that I assess highly in terms of my winner ranking. Like, if Godfrey went on to win, he would not be particularly high on my winner ranking, but I do think it's a very impressive game to see. I think it started off pretty rough, but by the time of him being on the block against JP, I think he plays pretty well from that point forward. Again, being able to call out Zach, again, being this very innovative move that is able to actually get him safety through the fact that people just assume that he's going to be targeting Zach. Him, again, playing that endgame stretch very well, again, positioning himself in the middle of all these different duos. And while, again, I think some comp results could have led to him having pretty unlucky downfall, I do think he ends up playing that stretch of the game pretty well. Problem is, obviously, he makes that wrong decision at the end. And I think that is something that obviously cost him the game and does come from a pretty bad read. Though also, again, a understandable one to a degree, but one that, again, I don't think was fully thought through. So again, I do think Godfrey is a player here that has a lot of strengths. Now, again, he's not flawless. He certainly makes a good chunk of mistakes. I think his early game is also, again, like very rough. But also, I think Godfrey was just a fun character on the show. One that was able to really ham up his game, prop up how intentional his game was. Again, he was an incredible character. I mean, one that, again, I loved at the time. I am mind blown at the fact that we never got to see him play again. Especially because of the fact that we do see him make cameo appearances here and there, to where, I don't know what happened with him not being on BB Can 5 or, again, getting some other appearance at some point down the road. But I do think the fact that we never got to see Godfrey again is probably actually one of the biggest travesties from the fact that we never got a full-blown returnee season, as he's just someone that, again, I fully would have expected to see back at some point down the road. And then with that, we move on to the winner of the season. We got Sarah Hanlon. And again, I've obviously said my piece throughout this entire video. I feel like really a main portion of this video has been dedicated to calling out how bad Sarah's game is at multiple points in the season. Though, again, with that said, it's not like Sarah's like an entirely bad player. I do think Sarah has some strengths for sure. I think she does do very well building these one-on-one bonds. I think she's able to build off this perception, the fact that she is this big mastermind in the game, even though the reality is that she isn't. To where, again, most of the jury adored her. Really, outside of Bobby and Bruno, the jury did really like Sarah. And I think her inherent likability is something that definitely obviously factor into her game here. That being said, again, I think she's a complete mess strategically. I think she pretty much makes the wrong strategic decision at almost every turn. She obviously gets very benefited by twists that don't even happen directly to her and more so happen to her allies. Again, Brittany having that triple HOH, Brittany having the coup d'etat, Cindy coming back into the game, being explicitly told to work with Sarah. I think those are all very luck-based circumstances that could have helped her in the game, even though I actually don't even think she necessarily plays all those well either, considering the fact that, again, I think she just makes a wrong strategic call at almost every turn. And again, that's just this weird thing with Sarah, and the fact that I don't even think I agree with like almost any strategic decision she makes across season outside of taking out Zach. But again, that's because it was so obvious that she needed to take out Zach. And again, probably taking out Greg. But like still, it's like, I just don't think Sarah plays the game particularly optimally and kind of just stumbles her way into a winning scenario. And again, I think on the show, I'm kind of conflicted on Sarah. I mean, again, she obviously was adored by the audience. Again, looked at as this massive underdog, massive fan favorite at the time. And I think I got that early on. However, I think as the season goes on, again, I do feel she gets just very petulant over how no one's playing the game and why am I being faulted for playing the game? And it really just feels like she's on this massive high horse to the fact that, how come you're not letting me play the game? And again, it's like, maybe play better to have people actively want to work with you in the game, and maybe not vote out allies at the point where they do want to work with you in the game. Where again, I think Sarah is just, again, very frustrating in that sense as well. But again, I do get why people did like her. Again, this massive underdog figure that stood up against, again, the people that were not particularly liked. Where again, you had like the Diaper Alliance, the Chop Shop, these again very unpopular alliances, and Sarah was always combating them. To where again, I get her popularity, though it's also a spot where again, I just come out of already experiencing BB Can 3 just being refamiliarized with, again, just how bad Sarah's winning game is, but also how frustrating she can be as a character at points as well, where again, obviously not my favorite winner on the board. But there we go. I mean, that's the entirety of BB Can 3. And again, just general thoughts on the season. Despite the fact that it doesn't end in the way that I personally would have wanted to, that doesn't really affect my overall opinion of the season. I still think this is a fun ride with some fun characters and players, and obviously some big moves along the way, also some big twists along the way, though this season I really do just wish that the game was given a bit more time to breathe, considering again the ridiculous number of twists on this season that would just happen constantly every week. It ends up harming the purity of the gameplay in a season that again had so much fluidity and so many super fans, where it's kind of underwhelming that the producers didn't really have as much confidence in the product to allow the players to just play. For a while, again, it's a season that I have a lot of nostalgia for. I still think it's a really fun season. I do get a lot of the criticisms for this season. I get why this is looked by some as a lesser BB Can season. For a while, it's a season that I don't think stands amongst the best of the best BB Can seasons. I still think it's one that has enough good in it to make it a pretty solid middle tier season of the show. But with that, those are my opinions on BB Can 3. Now, again, I will be doing a play ranking for BB Can 3 at some point down the road. I'll likely be back next year for a BB Can 4 retrospective, so stay tuned for that. And obviously, outside that, not really sure how much BB Can stuff I'm going to be doing, especially considering the fact that obviously BB Can, at least as of right now, is still off TV. So, again, if it comes back at any point, obviously I'll go back to covering that, though really outside that, again, not sure how much content there'll really be, but again, periodically, there'll be stuff here and there. But beyond that, obviously, just expect more of the same style of content about Survivor, Big Brother, other random things I cover. But again, for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching. Cindy Finesse. Cindy Finesse, Cindy Finesse, Cindy Finesse, Cindy Finesse, Cindy Finesse, Cindy Finesse. We do see Cindy with an S. We do see Cindy with an S. We do see Cindy with an S. Cindy with an S. Cindy Finesse, Cindy Finesse, Cindy Finesse. See if that works.